Eleanor Whitaker hit the floor of the general store before anyone moved. Martha Mercer had shoved her so hard the wooden crates rattled, and every person inside that crowded room looked away, looked at their boots, at the ceiling, at anything except the heavy-set woman curled on the dusty floor with a split lip and trembling hands. Nobody moved. Nobody ever moved, until the bell above the door rang once, and a tall rancher stepped inside, and for the first time in 3 years, someone looked directly at Eleanor. If this story already has your heart pounding, you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe to this channel right now and follow Eleanor's journey all the way to the end, because I promise you, you will not want to miss a single moment of what happens next. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Eleanor Whitaker had learned to make herself small. Not small in body, she was a full-figured woman, wide-shouldered and solid, with the kind of frame that had been built for hard work and harder living. She stood nearly 5'7" and carried herself with the rounded posture of someone who had spent years trying to take up less space in rooms that already made clear she was not welcome in them. But small in presence, small in sound, small in the particular, practiced way that a woman learns when smallness is the only thing that keeps a hand from swinging toward her face. She had been perfecting that smallness for 3 years. 3 years since the fever took her husband Daniel Mercer 40 miles outside of Billings on a cattle drive he never should have taken in the first place. 3 years since she had stood at the edge of an open grave in a black dress that didn't fit right and listened to Calvin Mercer, Daniel's older brother. The man who now controlled everything leaned down and whispered into her ear with the particular softness of someone who wants to make sure only one person hears. "You got nowhere to go, Eleanor. You understand me? Nowhere." She had nodded, because it was true, her parents were gone. Her one aunt had died the previous winter. She had no money of her own, no land, no wagon, nothing that bore her name rather than the Mercer name. She was 25 years old, and standing at the edge of a grave in a dress that didn't fit, and the only person offering her any kind of future was the man whispering threats into her ear at her husband's funeral. So she stayed. She cooked, she cleaned, she repaired fences when the hired men didn't bother, and she hauled water from the creek when the pump froze in February. And she sat at the table every evening and ate whatever was left after Calvin and Martha and their 2 grown sons had already helped themselves, which was usually not much. Martha Mercer was a woman built entirely from bitterness. She had a narrow face and pale, quick eyes, and she had the gift, if it could be called that, of finding the most precise and devastating thing to say at any given moment. She had hated Eleanor from the first time Daniel brought her home. Eleanor had always suspected it was because Martha recognized in Eleanor something she herself had wanted once: softness, warmth, the ability to love without conditions, and had long since decided that anything she couldn't possess should be destroyed instead. "Your biscuits are hard as rocks," Martha would say, dropping the entire pan of them on the floor in front of Eleanor, making her pick them up one by one. I don't know what Daniel was thinking, bringing home something so useless. "Look at you," she said more than once, looking Eleanor up and down with a contempt so thorough it felt like being skinned. "Taking up space at my table and giving nothing back. A cow gives milk at least. What do you give?" And Calvin was no different, only quieter about it. Calvin preferred action to words, a hand at Eleanor's elbow squeezing too hard, a boot shoved against hers under the table when she said something he didn't like, a plate slid off the counter by his arm, and then his eyes cutting to her clean this up without a single word spoken. She cleaned it up. She always cleaned it up. Their sons, both thick-necked young men who had absorbed their parents' cruelties like they were lessons in scripture, had taken to standing too close to Eleanor when they passed her in the narrow hallways of the ranch house. They never touched her, not exactly, but the threat of it lived in every interaction, a blade kept just inside its sheath. Eleanor slept with the door braced shut. She woke before dawn every morning. She had stopped crying somewhere around the 2nd year. Not because the pain had lessened, but because she had simply run out. You can only grieve for so long before grief itself becomes exhausted and leaves behind something quieter and more dangerous, a numbness, a flatness, a way of moving through the hours without expecting them to mean anything. By the summer of 1882, Eleanor Whitaker had nearly stopped expecting anything at all. The town of Willow Creek, Montana, was the kind of place that knew everything and said nothing. It was a small sun-bleached collection of wooden buildings, strung along a main street that turned to mud in the spring and dust in the summer. And everyone within a 20-mile radius knew everyone else's name and business and history going back 3 generations. They knew about the Mercer family. They knew about Eleanor. They had watched her shrink over 3 years, with the particular discomfort of people who witness something wrong, and have decided collectively that intervention is not their business. Reverend Aldous had spoken to Calvin once, early on, in the careful and diplomatic way of men who do not want to make enemies. Calvin had donated generously to the church the following Sunday, and the Reverend had not spoken to him again on the subject. Margaret Hale at the dry goods store always gave Eleanor a few extra pennies of credit when she came in alone, and always made sure to have a reason to step outside when Martha was there. That was the full extent of what the town was willing to do. Nobody wanted trouble with the Mercer family. Calvin Mercer owned the largest cattle operation in the county. He employed 6 men directly and did business with a dozen more. He had the ear of the county sheriff, a slow-moving and easily convinced man named Pritchard, who had accepted too many of Calvin's dinner invitations to remember clearly which side of the law he was supposed to be on. So the town watched, and the town looked away, and Eleanor Whitaker learned to make herself smaller and smaller and smaller still, until the morning in late July when everything finally broke open. It started with laundry. It always started with something small. Eleanor had been washing and hanging clothes since before sunrise, working through the heat that was already building at 6 in the morning, her hands raw from the lye soap, her back aching from bending over the washboard. She had gotten through Calvin's shirts and Martha's dresses and the household linens, and she was working through the last of it when she realized she had run short of pins and would need to go to the general store. She went to Martha first, because she had learned the hard way that going anywhere without informing Martha first was treated as a kind of theft. "I need to go to Mitchell's," she said, keeping her voice flat and even. "We're out of pins." Martha looked up from her chair, where she was doing nothing except fanning herself and radiating disapproval. "We're out because you lost half of them last week." "I didn't lose them. The wind took them off the line." Martha's eyes sharpened. "Are you arguing with me?" "No, ma'am," didn't sound like no. Eleanor looked at the floor. "I need pins to finish the wash. If you want the wash finished today, I need to go to Mitchell's." There was a pause long enough to make Eleanor's stomach tighten. "Take the list from the kitchen," Martha said finally, waving her hand as if swatting a fly. "Tell Mitchell to put it on the account, and don't you dawdle. I want everything on the line by noon." The walk to town took 15 minutes on the dusty road. Eleanor did it without a hat because she had lost her good bonnet in the spring when Martha had taken it, tried it on, declared it unflattering, and thrown it in the fire. She had a worn calico bonnet left, but it was so faded and shapeless she had stopped wearing it out of a kind of pride that she hadn't yet managed to fully surrender. The sun was brutal by 8 in the morning. She kept her head down and walked. Mitchell's General Store was the largest building on Willow Creek's main street, a wide-fronted establishment with a covered porch where 3 old men sat every morning playing cards and commenting on everything that passed by. They watched Eleanor come down the street without acknowledging her, which was the same as always, and she climbed the steps and pushed open the door and felt the marginal relief of shade. The store was busy for a Tuesday morning. Margaret Hale was there with her daughter. 2 ranch hands from the Dunmore spread were looking at rope and talking too loudly. A woman Eleanor didn't recognize was examining bolts of fabric near the window. And behind the counter, Owen Mitchell, a round-faced, pleasant man who was kind to everyone and confrontational toward, was measuring out a length of ribbon and pretending not to notice the tension that had followed Eleanor through the door. Because Martha Mercer was already there, Eleanor went still. She hadn't known Martha planned to come to town. She had said nothing about it, which meant she had known Eleanor was coming and had decided to be here first, which meant this morning had been planned in some way. Eleanor didn't yet understand. "There she is," Martha said, not looking up from the counter where she was examining a display of buttons. Her voice was bright and social, the voice she used in public, warm on the surface, with the blade hidden underneath. "My useless little house ghost." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Nobody spoke. Eleanor moved toward the back of the store, toward the sewing notions, keeping her head down and her steps quiet. "Eleanor," Martha's voice dropped a register. "Come here." Eleanor stopped, turned, walked back toward the counter. "Look at this," Martha said, holding up a length of blue ribbon. "Does this look like the right shade to you?" Eleanor looked at the ribbon. "It's lovely, Mrs. Mercer. Don't patronize me. Does it match or doesn't it?" "I think it does, you think." Martha set the ribbon down. 3 years in my house, and she still can't give a straight answer about a piece of ribbon. She addressed this to the room at large, smiling in a way that invited everyone else to share in the mild, friendly contempt. "She's useless with colors. Useless with most things, if I'm honest." Eleanor said nothing. "She ruined a good shirt of Calvin's last week," Martha continued. "Did you know that? Put it in too hot a wash and shrunk it down to half its size." "A new shirt. Cost him good money. I'm sorry about the shirt," Eleanor said. "Sorry doesn't replace a shirt. No, ma'am. Sorry is all she ever says." Martha turned now to look directly at Eleanor, and the social warmth drained out of her face the way water drains out of a cracked pot slowly, and then all at once. "You come into a store you have no business coming into, buying things with money you didn't earn, wearing that face like the whole world owes you something." "I was sent for pins," Eleanor said. Her voice was very quiet. "For the wash. Don't you talk back to me?" "I wasn't talking back." "I was explaining." Martha's hand shot out and closed around Eleanor's wrist, not a slap. Something worse. A grabbing hold that twisted just enough to make Eleanor gasp and yanked her forward, off balance, so that Eleanor stumbled against the edge of the counter and nearly went down. The room froze. Every person in that store went absolutely still. Owen Mitchell looked at his ribbon. Margaret Hale looked at her daughter. The ranch hands suddenly found the rope very interesting. "Don't you ever," Martha said, very soft and very close to Eleanor's face, "raise your voice to me in public. Do you understand me?" Eleanor's wrist was burning. She could feel her heartbeat in her fingers. Her eyes were stinging, not with tears. She had told herself she was done with tears in public, but with the particular sharpness of humiliation, which is a different kind of pain altogether. She nodded. "I understand," Eleanor said. "Mrs. Mercer." Martha released her wrist and straightened up, smoothing her dress, and the social warmth came back into her face like a curtain being drawn across a window. "Good, now get your pins and get back to the house. I'll be home within the hour, and I expect that wash to be finished." She turned back to the ribbon, as if nothing had happened. As if Eleanor was not standing 3 feet away with a bruised wrist and burning eyes, surrounded by every person in the room who had watched and done nothing. Eleanor stood there for a moment, just a moment, and then the bell above the door rang. She heard the sound of boots on the wooden floor, slow, deliberate, unhurried, the particular sound of someone who is not afraid of the space they are walking into. She didn't look up right away. She had learned not to look up at things that weren't going to help her. But something in the quality of the silence that followed made her raise her eyes. The man who had walked through the door was tall, not dramatically so, but the kind of tall that fills a doorframe without effort, the kind of height that is simply part of a person, without calling attention to itself. He was lean through the shoulders in the way of men who work, rather than men who are simply built, and he was dressed in the plain, practical clothing of a working rancher: dusty trail coat, worn boots, a dark hat that he did not remove when he entered, which Eleanor noticed because most men removed their hats when they came into a store. He was older, somewhere in his mid to late 30s, with the sun-darkened skin of someone who spent most of his hours outdoors, and dark brown hair going gray at the temples. And a face that was not exactly handsome in any conventional sense, but had the kind of stillness in it that made it memorable. Deep-set eyes, dark as creek water, a jaw that looked like it had been set firmly against things for a very long time. He stepped inside and looked around the room in the unhurried way of a man assessing a situation, and his eyes moved from face to face the ranch hands, Owen Mitchell, Margaret Hale, and then they found Eleanor. And they stayed there. Not in the way men sometimes looked at Eleanor, which was either with dismissal or with the particular crawling discomfort of men, who are not sure whether they find her attractive and are ashamed of their uncertainty. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand, steady, serious, without flinching. He looked at her bruised wrist. He looked at her face. Eleanor dropped her gaze. She heard him walk to the counter. She heard him say something quietly to Owen Mitchell about a feed order, and she gathered herself and moved to the back of the store to find her pins. Because the wash still needed finishing, and Martha would be home within the hour, and she had no space in her life for whatever was happening in her chest right now. She found the pins. She brought them to the counter. Martha was still at the other end, talking to someone now, laughing in her public laugh. The man in the dark coat was standing very close to the counter, close enough that Eleanor had to pass near him to pay for her pins, and as she laid the small paper packet on the counter, she felt him look at her again. She did not look up. Owen Mitchell took her money and counted change. "Ma'am," said a voice beside her, very quiet, not directed at the room. Directed at her. Eleanor looked up. The man was looking at her with the same direct, unreadable expression. Up close, his eyes were darker than she had thought, almost black, and there was something in them that she could not immediately name. Not pity, not sympathy exactly, something more fundamental than either. Something like recognition. "You all right?" he said. 3 words, such a simple question, such an absolutely devastating question when it has been years since anyone asked it and meant it. Eleanor opened her mouth, closed it. "I'm fine," she said. It came out in barely a whisper. He looked at her wrist. Back at her face. He didn't say anything else. He just looked at her as if her answer had not quite convinced him, and then he turned back to the counter, and Eleanor gathered her pins and walked toward the door. And her heart was beating in a strange, complicated way she didn't know what to do with. She was almost at the door when Martha's voice cut across the room. "Eleanor, did you thank Mr. Mitchell for the credit?" "Yes, ma'am. Did you apologize for wasting his time?" "I know. I didn't realize I'd go back and do it." Eleanor stopped, turned, walked back toward the counter. Her face was burning now. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "I apologize for my—" "She doesn't need to apologize for anything," said a voice. Quiet, flat, completely without anger, which made it somehow more arresting than if it had been loud. The room went absolutely silent. Martha turned. The man in the dark coat had not moved from his position at the counter. He was looking at Martha Mercer with an expression of complete composure, not challenge, not aggression, simply the steadiness of someone who has said a true thing and sees no reason to back away from it. "I beg your pardon," Martha said. Her voice had the sharpness of someone who is not accustomed to being contradicted. "She came in here, made a purchase, left," the man said. "That ain't wasting anyone's time, ain't anything to apologize for." "I don't know who you are," Martha said, "but this is a private matter between—" "Ain't private," he said, "if you do it in a room full of people." The ranch hands had turned around now. Margaret Hale had stopped pretending to look at fabric. Owen Mitchell had gone very still behind his counter, with the particular stillness of a man who desperately does not want to be involved, but is also not going to miss what happens next. Martha's chin came up. "This woman is under my household's care. She is my responsibility, and what happens between her and me is—" "A responsibility," he said, "that involves grabbing her wrist hard enough to leave marks?" Complete silence. Martha's face went white and then red in the space of a single breath. Eleanor stood very still. She was not breathing. "You don't know anything about our situation," Martha said. "No, ma'am," he said. "I just know what I see." He turned then and looked at Eleanor directly. Fully, with the same unreadable steadiness that had unsettled her before, but closer now and more deliberate. "What's your name?" he said, quietly, just to her. Eleanor's voice had almost entirely left her. "Eleanor," she managed. Eleanor Whitaker. Silas Beaumont, he said. He touched the brim of his hat, not removing it, not a performance. Just a gesture, automatic and genuine. Then he looked at her for another long moment, and she saw something move across his face, not decision exactly, but the thing that precedes decision. The moment when a man who has been telling himself it isn't his business finally accepts that he has made it his business. He looked back at Martha. Where does she live? He said. Martha blinked. What? Where does she live? Your ranch? Yes, she lives in our home she's part of. She coming back with you now? Of course she's coming back. She lives, does she want to? The question landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water, and the silence that spread out from it was total. Martha stared at him. I'm sorry, I said, does she want to? He was looking at Eleanor again now. Ma'am, you want to go back with her? Eleanor's heart was going so fast she could feel it in her throat. Her wrist was throbbing, her face was still burning. Every person in the room was looking at her, Martha with outrage, Owen Mitchell with barely concealed astonishment, the ranch hands with the wide-eyed attention of men watching something they will be describing in detail for the next several years. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. You don't have to answer right now, Silas said. His voice was still quiet, still completely even, but I'm asking. Martha made a sharp sound that was not quite a laugh. This is absolutely ridiculous. You have no right to. Who do you think you are walking into? I know who I am, Silas said. Question is whether anyone in this room knows who she is. He let that land. Then he said, I'm going to step outside and check on my horse. I'll be on the porch. He looked at Eleanor one more time, direct, unhurried, without pressure. If you want a different choice than the one you've been given, he said, I'll be right outside. He turned and walked to the door, and the bell rang when he went through it, and Eleanor stood in the middle of the store with her packet of pins and her bruised wrist and her burning face. And Martha was already speaking again, voice low and furious and vicious. Don't you dare, Martha said. Don't you even think about it. You walk out that door and you'll have nothing. You hear me? You will have absolutely nothing. You'll be a woman alone on the plains with no name and no home and no. I already have nothing, Eleanor said. Her own voice surprised her. Quiet, steady, she had not planned it. The words had simply come, the way things come when something inside you that has been dammed up for a very long time finally finds the smallest crack. Martha stared at her. I beg your pardon? Martha said, and her voice was soft and dangerous in the way of something about to strike. Eleanor looked at her, at the narrow, pale, furious face. At the woman who had taken 3 years of her life and crushed them between her hands like dried leaves. And something inside Eleanor, something small and quiet and stubborn that had survived everything they had done to it, steadied. I said I already have nothing, Eleanor repeated. You've been telling me that for 3 years, so there's nothing to lose. The silence was complete. Then Eleanor walked toward the door. Her legs were trembling, her hands were trembling. The packet of pins was crinkled in her grip. She pushed open the door and stepped out into the blazing summer sun, and Silas Beaumont was exactly where he said he would be, standing at the edge of the porch, one hand resting loosely on the hitching rail. His dark eyes finding her immediately when she came through the door. He didn't look surprised, he didn't look relieved. He looked at her the way he had looked at her from the beginning, steadily, directly, as if she was simply a person who existed and deserved to be seen. I don't have anything, Eleanor said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. I don't have money, Didn't ask about any of that, Silas said. You should know, she said, before whatever this is. Whatever this is, he said, is just an offer. You can say no. She looked at him. What kind of offer? Safe place to be, he said. My ranch is about 2 hours north, got a spare room. No strings attached to it. You'd have your own space, your own time, and I wouldn't ask you for anything. Why, Eleanor said. It came out raw and direct because she had no armor left for anything else. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive thinking. Lost my mother and my sister when I was 17, he said finally. Fever, same as what happens around here, he paused. Neighbor man had been hurting them for years. Nobody in town did anything about it. I was 17 and couldn't do anything either. His jaw tightened slightly. I've been doing nothing my whole life and calling it minding my own business. I'm done with that. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. They'll come after me, she said. Probably. Calvin, that's her husband. He has men who work for him. And the sheriff I know, Pritchard, Silas said. He's not as comfortable with himself as he pretends to be. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself despite the heat. I'm not the kind of person who, she stopped. Try it again. I don't want charity. Ain't charity, he said. I got a working ranch and I could use help around the place. Whatever you want to give, you give. Whatever you don't, you don't. But either way, the room is yours and nobody touches you there. The door behind Eleanor opened. Calvin Mercer stepped onto the porch. He must have come from somewhere down the street. He hadn't been inside the store, but Martha had found him, because Martha always found Calvin when she needed muscle behind her words. He was a big man, broad across the chest, with a face like weathered saddle leather and eyes the pale, calculating color of water in an overcast sky. He looked at Silas. His expression said very clearly that he was unimpressed. Beaumont, he said. He knew the name, apparently. What exactly do you think you're doing? Having a conversation, Silas said. You're interfering with something that doesn't concern you. Is that what I'm doing? It was not a question. Calvin looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man who cannot decide whether he's angry or simply tired. Eleanor, get in the wagon. We're going home. Eleanor looked at Calvin. She had looked at him so many times over 3 years, always looking away first, always dropping her gaze, always making herself smaller so the moment would pass. She looked at him now and felt strangely, almost nothing. As if the part of her that had been afraid of him had gone somewhere quiet and was simply watching. No, she said. Calvin blinked, as if the word had no meaning to him in this context. What did you said no? Her voice was not loud. Not angry, just solid. I'm not going back. The porch had accumulated an audience. The 3 old card players were no longer pretending to look away. Several people who had been inside the store had drifted to the doorway, and more were gathering from the street, drawn by the particular magnetic pull of a public confrontation in a small town. Calvin's jaw tightened. He looked at Silas. You put her up to this? She put herself up to it, Silas said. I just asked a question. You have no legal right to... She's not your property, Mercer. Calvin's eyes narrowed. She owes us a debt, signed paperwork. You want to talk about legal rights? We can start there. Daniel's debt became her debt when he died, and she ain't cleared it. Silas was quiet for a moment. How much? Calvin blinked. What? The debt. How much? That is not the... How much? Calvin looked at him with the dawning, uncomfortable expression of a man who has just realized that the conversation has moved in a direction he did not anticipate. He named a figure. It was inflated. Eleanor knew it was inflated, because she had heard them use it on her often enough to know the number changed, depending on what they wanted it to accomplish, but she said nothing. Silas reached into his coat. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. Eleanor looked at it. Letter of credit, Silas said. He held it out to Calvin without stepping closer. Bank and billings. Good for twice what you named. You want to take Eleanor back to that house over a debt. Here's your debt settled. The silence on that porch was enormous. Calvin stared at the letter. He stared at Silas. His face was going through a series of calculations that were visible even from where Eleanor stood, the math of a man who has realized that his leverage has been removed, that the argument he was prepared to make no longer applies, and that what he does next will be watched and remembered by a porch full of people who will carry it into every conversation in this town for the next decade. This ain't over, Calvin said, very quiet, very cold. That's up to you, Silas said. Calvin looked at Eleanor, and in his eyes she saw something she had not expected, not rage, but something more stripped down than rage. Something almost like the look of a man who has been caught, and knows it, and hasn't yet found the face to wear in response to being caught. He turned and walked off the porch. The audience parted for him. Martha appeared at the doorway, took in the scene, looked at Eleanor with an expression that was pure blade fury and contempt, and something underneath them both that Eleanor, in all her years in that house, had never quite named, and then turned and followed her husband. Eleanor stood on the porch in the blazing summer heat and watched them go. Her hands had stopped trembling. She didn't know exactly when that had happened. "You don't have to thank me," Silas said behind her. Quiet, practical. "I know," she said. She turned around. He was watching her with the same steady expression. Patient, unhurried. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "I don't know if I can trust you." "You can't," he said. "Not yet. Trust takes time. I'd be worried if you handed it over just because I did one decent thing on a Tuesday morning." Something moved in Eleanor's chest, something that had not moved in a very long time. "I'll get my thing," she said. "There isn't much. I can carry it." "Take your time," Silas said. He turned toward his horse at the hitching rail, checking the saddle with the unhurried competence of a man who is comfortable waiting. Eleanor stood for one more moment on the porch of Mitchell's General Store in Willow Creek, Montana, with the summer sun pressing down on her bare head and the sound of the town resuming its normal rhythms all around her. And she thought not in words exactly, but in the wordless way of things you know before you can say them, that she did not know what came next. She did not know if she was making the right choice. She did not know if Silas Beaumont was who he appeared to be, or if this was simply one trap opening into another. But she knew with the same wordless certainty that she had said no. Out loud, in public, and the world had not ended. The wagon she had arrived on was sitting 2 lots down the street in front of the feed store where Calvin had left it. She walked to it, and she climbed up without asking for help, and she reached under the seat for the small bundle she had wrapped that morning, before she left, not planning this. Not planning anything, just the habit of a woman who has learned to be ready to move. A change of dress, her mother's Bible, a small tin that held $3.40 she had saved from years of errand money, 2 pennies at a time, never letting Martha know it existed. That was everything Eleanor Whitaker owned in the world. She climbed back down with it. She walked to where Silas stood by his wagon. He looked at her bundle, looked at her face. He did not say anything. He simply offered his hand to help her up. Eleanor looked at the hand. She thought about everything those hands could mean. Everything hands had meant, in her experience, in this house, in this life. Then she took it. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. Silas walked around to the other side, climbed up, gathered the reins. He clicked to the horse. The wagon rolled forward. And Eleanor Whitaker left Willow Creek behind her, without looking back, not out of triumph, not out of certainty, but because looking back was a thing she had done long enough, and the road ahead, for the first time in 3 years, stretched out in front of her, like something that had not yet been decided. Like something that still could be. The wagon rolled north out of Willow Creek, and Eleanor sat with her small bundle pressed against her side and her hands folded in her lap, and she did not speak for a very long time. Neither did Silas. The silence between them was not comfortable exactly. It was too new for that, too careful, but it was not threatening either. And Eleanor had learned over 3 years to read silence the way some people read weather, to feel its temperature before it broke. This one was simply quiet, a man driving a wagon, a woman sitting beside him. 2 strangers moving through the summer heat, toward a destination only one of them knew. She watched the road. She thought about Martha's face when Eleanor had walked out of the store. She thought about Calvin's eyes on the porch, that sit-down look she had never seen on him before, the look of a man whose grip on something had simply opened, and the something had walked away. She thought about the $3.40 in the tin against her ribs. "How far did you say?" she asked. "About 2 hours, Silas said. "Maybe less. Horses fresh? What's it called? Your ranch?" "The Beaumont place," he said. Never gave it a name beyond that. Always seemed like the kind of thing people do when they're trying to impress somebody. "And you're not?" He glanced at her sideways. "No, ma'am." "Can't say that I am." Eleanor looked down at her hands. "You paid a debt that wasn't yours. That money, the letter of credit." "Is a letter of credit. I'll call it in when the timing's right." "From Calvin." She turned to look at him. He'll never pay that willingly. I know it, then why? Because it changed what he could do this morning, Silas said simply. Couldn't drag you back over a debt that's been settled. That was the point. The money's just a piece of paper. The point was giving you a clean step out. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. The wagon jolted over a rut in the road, and she braced herself against the seat without thinking, the automatic reflex of a body that had learned to brace for impact. You don't know me, she said again. Said that already, he said. I mean, you don't know what kind of person I am. I could be, I might be. You might be any number of things, Silas said. So might I. We'll figure it out as we go. That doesn't worry you? He thought about it, genuinely thought about it, which she was already beginning to notice was his way. He did not answer quickly, did not give the easy answer, but sat with a question until he found the one that was actually true. Worry is a thing I do plenty of, he said finally. Just not about that particular question. Eleanor turned back to the road. A hawk wheeled overhead, slow and distant. Why do you live alone, she asked. The town talks about you like you've been alone a long time. 10 years, he said. What happened? A pause. Long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then had a wife. Her name was Clara. She died in childbirth. The baby with her. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. I'm sorry, it was a long time ago, he said, not dismissively, just factually. Long time ago, and I've made my peace with the shape of it. But it's why I'm careful about people. Used to not be. Used to think the world was a straightforward kind of place. He paused. I know better now, so do I, Eleanor said quietly. He looked at her again. Something in his face shifted, barely perceptible. I expect you do, he said. They drove in silence for a while after that. Not the careful, testing silence from before, something easier. Like two people who have established that neither of them is going to pretend. She noticed things about him in small installments. The way he handled the reins loosely, no tension, the way a man holds something he trusts. The way he occasionally clicked his tongue at the horse when the road got rough, a sound so automatic she wasn't sure he knew he was doing it. The way he kept his eyes moving without appearing anxious, just watchful, the alert calm of someone who has spent years in open country. She noticed he did not look at her body the way men sometimes did, with that uncomfortable flickering assessment she had learned to dread. He looked at her face when he spoke to her, at her hands when they told him something about what she was feeling, at the road the rest of the time. She found herself, very cautiously, beginning to breathe. When the ranch came into view, a cluster of buildings set against the rise of land that went up toward the foothills, simple and well kept, with a big vegetable garden spreading out from the east side of the house and a barn that had clearly been recently repaired. Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in so long she barely recognized it. Curiosity, not dread of a new place.
Actual curiosity.
Silas pulled the wagon up to the front of the house and climbed down, and he came around to her side and offered his hand again, and again she took it, and the helping down was just practical and nothing else. A thing done because the wagon was high and the ground was far, and that was all there was to it. She stood and looked at the house, weathered boards. A porch with 2 chairs on it, a door that had been painted dark green at some point years ago, now faded to something close to gray. Come on in, Silas said. I'll show you the room. Inside, the house was clean in the way of a place kept by someone who is orderly by nature rather than by habit, not spotless. Not the pressed and proper cleanliness of Martha Mercer's kitchen, where Eleanor had spent 3 years afraid to leave fingerprints on the wrong surface, but genuinely clean, organized, the kind of space that said this person lives carefully. A main room with a long table and 2 chairs, a stone fireplace. A kitchen that was sparse but fully functional. 3 doors off the main room. Silas opened the middle door. This one, he said. Eleanor stepped inside a room, a real private room with a window that looked east, a narrow bed with a clean quilt on it, a small dresser, and a wooden chair beside the window. Nothing elaborate, nothing soft beyond necessity, but it locked from the inside. She saw the latch on the inside of the door, and she stared at it for a moment that lasted longer than it should have, and something happened in her chest that was not quite a feeling she had words for. Just a slow, spreading loosening of something that had been wound very tight. "Bathrooms through the back," Silas said from the doorway. He had not stepped into the room. He stood at the threshold, which she would come to learn was a thing he always did, never entering a space without being invited. As if he understood without being told that there were people in the world for whom the invasion of a private space was never a small thing. "Well's out back. I'll get water heated for you if you want to clean up." "You don't have to, I'm putting water on for myself anyway," he said. "Ain't any trouble." He left her alone. Eleanor stood in the middle of the room and listened to the silence. Not the silence of the Mercer house, which was never truly silent, always threaded through with the particular menace of waiting, the kind of quiet that preceded something unpleasant. This was different. This was just quiet, the house settling around her. The distant sound of horses somewhere outside, the sound of water being pumped from the well. She sat on the edge of the bed. She put her bundle down beside her. She sat there for a long time without moving. And then very quietly, alone in a room with a latch on the inside of the door, Eleanor Whitaker pressed her hands flat against the quilt and felt the solid, ordinary reality of the mattress beneath her, and she cried. Not the tightly controlled, quickly suppressed kind of crying she had trained herself to do in the Mercer house, in the outhouse, under the sound of the pump, anywhere that sound could be covered by something else. She cried the way a person cries when the thing that was holding them together finally believes it is safe to let go. Full, wrenching, exhausting, with her face in her hands and her shoulders shaking, and nobody in the world to hear it or use it against her. She cried for a long time. When she was done, she felt hollowed out and strangely light. She washed her face with water from the basin. She changed into her other dress, the clean one, the one she had packed. She smoothed her hair with the small comb from her bundle, and looked at herself briefly in the small mirror on the dresser. She looked older than 28. She had looked older than 28 for a while now. She went out to find Silas. He was in the kitchen, and there was a pot on the stove that smelled like something with beans and salt pork, and he was cutting bread with the efficient, unself-conscious competence of a man who has cooked for himself for a long time. He looked up when she came in, and then looked back at what he was doing. "Hungry," he said. "Yes," she admitted. "Sit down." "Won't be long." She sat at the table and watched him move around the kitchen, and there was something hypnotically ordinary about it, the simple, domestic rhythm of a meal being made that she found she could not stop watching. Not because it was remarkable, but because it had been so long since ordinary had felt safe. He set a bowl in front of her, a thick piece of bread beside it. A cup of coffee. He sat across from her with his own bowl, and they ate. It was not a fancy meal. The beans were simple, the pork was salt-heavy, the bread was a day old. But Eleanor ate every bite, and she drank the coffee down to the last of it, and when she was done she felt the particular, basic satisfaction of a body that has been given what it needed, without any price attached to it. "Thank you," she said. He said. They sat for a moment. "Rules," he said then. She looked up. Her shoulders had tensed reflexively. Rules, in her experience, were the architecture of a trap. He saw it. His expression didn't change, but she thought he saw it. "Simple ones," he said. "The horse needs feeding every morning before anything else. Gate to the south pasture has to be latched, or the fence doesn't hold it. I work early, usually out by 5, back by midday. What I ask of you is nothing, unless you decide to give it." "That's it." Eleanor looked at him. That's all. That's not how arrangements work. It's how this one does," he said. She shook her head slightly. "I can cook, I can clean, I can mend, I can help with whatever needs doing. I'm not going to sit in that room doing nothing while you—" "I didn't say you couldn't," he said. "I said I'm not requiring it." "There's a difference." He looked at her steadily. "You've been required your whole time over there. I figured you might want to remember what it's like to do something because you want to, not because someone will hurt you if you don't." The word hurt sat between them in the kitchen. He had said it plainly, without drama, and it was the plainness of it that struck her, the simple factual acknowledgement that yes, They had hurt her, that this was a thing that had happened and could be named. "All right," she said finally. "All right," he agreed. He picked up his cup. "Yes, please," she said. And that was how it began. The first week was strange in the way that all radical changes are strange, not in the quality of strangeness which she had expected, but in the direction of it. She had been braced for something difficult. She had been waiting to discover the hidden catch, the thing behind the thing, the payment that was being quietly accumulated against her. She had slept the first 2 nights with one hand on the latch, just in case. No catch appeared. Silas worked. He rose before dawn. She could hear him moving around the kitchen, making his own coffee. And then he went out and she would hear the barn door, and then nothing until midday. He did not knock on her door to give her instructions. He did not appear in the kitchen to check that she was doing something. He was simply gone working and the house was hers. She didn't know what to do with that at first. She kept waking early because her body didn't know how to sleep past 3 years of pre-dawn starts don't simply undo themselves in a week. She would lie in the bed in the gray morning light and listen to the sounds of the house, and she would tell herself she didn't have to get up. And then she would get up anyway, because lying still had started to feel uncomfortable in a different way than exhaustion. On the 3rd morning, she made breakfast before he came in. She found eggs. There were chickens. She had heard them and made a proper breakfast with eggs, and the leftover bread cut thin and fried in the pan, and coffee made strong, and she set it on the table and sat down. Silas came in from the barn with hay on his coat and looked at the table and then at her. "Didn't ask you to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He sat down. He ate. He didn't say it was good, which would have felt performative somehow, wouldn't have fit who he was. He just ate, and then he looked at her across the table and said, "You make it this way every time?" "What way?" "Strong," he said, holding up the cup. "I like it strong." "Good," so do I. He drank more of it. Martha Mercer always served it thin as water and twice as bitter. Eleanor stared at him for a moment. Then she laughed. It came out of her suddenly, unexpectedly, a real laugh, not the small, controlled sounds she had sometimes made in company, because silence seemed rude, but an actual, startled laugh at something that was genuinely funny. The look of mild offense on his face at the memory of bad coffee. It was such an ordinary thing to be offended by. Silas looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not a smile exactly, more like the suggestion of one tucked carefully behind his composure. "Didn't mean to be funny," he said. "I know," she said, catching her breath. "That's what made it funny." He looked at his coffee. He said, but the edges of it were warmer than before. She went to work in the garden that afternoon, not because she had been told to, but because she had looked at it from the window and seen that it needed tending, and her hands needed something to do. She had always loved growing things in another life, in the life before. She had kept a small kitchen garden at her parents' house that had been her particular pride. She had not been allowed to plant anything at the Mercer place. The earth there, Martha had declared, did not need decorating. She pulled weeds for 2 hours in the afternoon heat and felt the particular satisfaction of visible progress, of a thing that had been disordered becoming ordered under her hands. She replanted 2 tomato starts that had tilted and staked them with sticks she found along the fence line. She found a patch of ground near the east side of the house that had been left bare, and she thought privately that it would take wildflowers well. Silas came back past midday and found her still out there, and he stood at the garden gate for a moment looking at what she'd done. "Didn't know those tomatoes were tilting," he said. "They've been tilting for a while," she said. "They'll be fine." He was quiet a moment. "Thank you," he said. It came out careful, like a word he didn't use carelessly. "I told you," she said, sitting back on her heels. "I wanted to." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he nodded and went toward the house, and she heard the pump running as he washed up, and he turned back to the garden with something warm sitting in her chest. The second week was easier than the first. Not comfortable, not yet, but easier. She started to learn the shape of the days, his rhythms. The way he moved through the house, what he needed where, the things he did without thinking, and the things he deliberated over. He was a deliberate man by nature. She was finding methodical, careful, someone who did not do things by accident and did not speak without thinking. She started telling him things. Small things at first. She mentioned that the window in her room was sticking, and he fixed it the next morning without comment. She mentioned that the coffee measured differently in his particular pot versus the one she was used to, and he looked at her with mild interest and asked what difference it made, and they spent 15 minutes in what was somehow an entirely serious conversation about coffee grounds. She noticed he was nursing a sore shoulder. She could see it in the way he held himself when he forgot to be careful, and she asked about it directly, which surprised him. Old injury, he said, fence post, about 4 years back. Does it get worse when it's going to rain? He looked at her. Yes, my father had something similar. He used to rub it with a liniment made from camphor and lard. I can make it if you have the ingredients. He had the ingredients. She made the liniment. She left it on the kitchen table the next morning without a note, because a note would have made it into something that needed acknowledging, and she had learned that Silas preferred things that didn't require acknowledgement. He used it. She knew because the small jar was on his side of the table every morning after that, and after 3 days his shoulder no longer betrayed him when he reached for the coffee pot. On the 10th day he came back from town. He had not told her he was going into Willow Creek, just said he had some business, and she had spent the hours of his absence with a low-grade anxiety that she couldn't entirely explain. Something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it. The knowledge that the world outside the ranch was still the world it had always been. He came back with her. She was standing on the porch when he came back, and she could see from his face, when he got down from the taxi, that something had happened in town. Not something devastating. His face was not that kind of closed, but something that needed saying. He came up the porch steps and took his hat off and turned it in his hands in the slow, habitual way she was starting to recognize as a sign that he was thinking something through. Calvin was in town, he said. Eleanor went still. And he was talking to Pritchard, the sheriff. He looked at her. They're putting a story together, saying you left of your own mental disturbance. That you're not in a right state of mind, and they've got a responsibility to bring you home. She felt the coldness move through her, familiar as weather. They'd have Pritchard come out here? They might try. He met her eyes. I want to be clear with you, that ain't going to work. Pritchard is a coward, and he knows I know it. But I want you knowing what they're doing so it's not a surprise. Eleanor pressed her lips together. Her hands were very still in her lap. Is that all he was saying? Silas paused, just a beat too long. There was more, she said. He was talking to some of the other ranchers. Saying I'd taken advantage of a vulnerable woman. He said it with a flatness that said the accusation was beneath dignifying. Trying to make the community uncomfortable with the situation. Eleanor felt the heat climb her face, not embarrassment, anger. A specific clarifying anger at the predictability of it, at the way Calvin moved through the world, like a man who understood that reputation was a weapon and had no compunctions about using it. He's trying to isolate you, she said. Silas looked at her. From the other ranchers, she said. If they're uncomfortable doing business with you, if they pull back. I know what he's doing, Silas said. His voice was even. I'm not worried about it. You should be. Those relationships matter for a ranch like this. Eleanor. He said her name quietly, directly. I know. And I'm not worried. You know why? Why? Because half those ranchers' wives were in Mitchell's store that morning. He settled back against the porch railing. They saw what they saw. And women who've seen a thing are harder to talk out of it than men who haven't. She looked at him for a long moment. You're more strategic than you seem. Something shifted in his face. The faintest trace of something that might, on another man, have been smugness, but on him was simply dry and private. I'm not as dumb as I look, he said. You don't look dumb at all, she said. Don't I? No. She paused. You look like a man and doesn't say much so people underestimate him. He looked at her steadily. You figured that out quick. I've had a lot of practice reading people, she said. The quiet that followed was different from the ones before, warmer, more textured. The quiet of two people who have just told each other something true without quite meaning to. "We'll be all right," he said finally. "But I wanted you to know." "Thank you," she said, "for telling me, for not deciding I didn't need to know." He nodded once, put his hat back on. "I'm gonna check the south fence before it gets dark. I'll have supper ready when you get back." He stopped at the steps and looked back at her. Not with the expression of a man who has been offered something, but with the expression of a man who is not sure what to do with the particular quality of an ordinary thing when it has been missing for a very long time. "All right," he said. He went to check the fence. Eleanor went inside to make supper, and the house moved around her with its familiar creaks and its particular quality of late afternoon light, and she thought about Calvin in town, about Pritchard's slow and compromised judgment, about the architecture of a trap that was already being built around her. And she thought, not this time. She had learned something in 3 years in that house. She had learned the shape of how men like Calvin thought. She had learned how they used paper and repetition and law and fear, always fear, to wall a person in. She had learned it the way you learn a thing, when the lesson is conducted on your body and your life. She knew what was coming. She put the pot on, and she thought clearly, steadily, without panic, about how to be ready for it. 3 days later, Pritchard came. She heard the horse first. She was in the garden, and the sound of a single horse coming up the north road was different from the sound of Silas's wagon, lighter, faster, and she straightened and waited. And when the rider came through the gate, she recognized Pritchard immediately. A heavy-set man with a drooping mustache and the particular defeated posture of someone who knows he is in the wrong, but has convinced himself he has no choice. He looked surprised to see her standing in the garden, upright, clearly not in any condition of mental disturbance. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, pulling up. "Sheriff Pritchard," she said. He turned his hat in his hands, the same gesture Silas used, she noticed, but on Pritchard it was nervous, where on Silas it was deliberate. "I've had some concerns raised about your situation here." "Is that right? Concerns about your state of mind? Whether you left the Mercer household of your own?" "I left the Mercer household of my own free will," Eleanor said. "In front of 20 witnesses in Mitchell's General Store. Including 3 of those witnesses being your own deputy's mother, if I'm remembering correctly." Pritchard's mustache moved. "Martha Mercer grabbed my wrist and left marks," Eleanor said. Her voice was clear and flat, and she did not look away from him. "That's assault, Sheriff. Is that what you've come out here to discuss? Because I'd be very interested in discussing it." Pritchard shifted in his saddle. The silence stretched. "The Mercer family's got concerns about." "The Mercer family's concerns are not your job," Eleanor said. "Unless they're filing a complaint that they witnessed a crime." "Are they filing a complaint?" "Well, they're concerned that you..." "Are they filing a complaint?" she said again, another long pause. "No," Pritchard admitted. "Then I think we're done," she said. "Aren't we, Sheriff?" It was not a question. Pritchard looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who had expected something different from this conversation. Something more pliant, more frightened, more easily managed. He looked at a woman standing in a garden in the afternoon sun, with her hands loose at her sides, and her eyes completely steady, and he looked at her the way people had been looking at her all week and not quite recognizing what they were seeing. They were seeing a woman who had stopped expecting to lose. I'll have to report back that you're here voluntarily," Pritchard said. "You do that," Eleanor said. He turned his horse, he rode away. Eleanor watched him go until he was through the gate, and then she let out a breath that had been sitting in her chest since she heard the hoofbeats on the road, slow and careful. And she turned back to the garden, and her hands were shaking slightly, and she let them shake, because there was nobody here to see it, and she had earned the shaking. She heard Silas behind her. She turned. He was standing at the corner of the barn. Had he been there the whole time? Had he watched? With his arms folded and his expression unreadable. "Were you listening?" she said. "I was available," he said, "in case you needed anything." She looked at him. "But you didn't step in. You didn't need me to," he said. Simple, factual. Something about that, the complete absence of condescension in it, the simple acknowledgement that she had handled it, because she could hit her somewhere deep and wordless. "He'll report back to Calvin," she said. "He will," Silas agreed. "And Calvin will think of something else." "I know," she said. "You're not afraid." It was not quite a question. Eleanor thought about it honestly. "I am," she said, "but it's a different kind of afraid. Before I was afraid of what they could do to me. Now I'm afraid of not getting this right. Of not being ready." She paused. "That's a better kind of afraid, I think." Silas looked at her for a long moment with the dark, steady eyes that she had come to think of as simply his, as characteristic of him, as the deliberate way he moved, or the way he turned his hat in his hands when he was thinking. "Yes," he said, "it is." He went back to the barn. Eleanor turned back to the garden. And somewhere in the space between those two plain facts, a man going back to work, a woman going back to work, the ordinary machinery of a day continuing to turn, something that neither of them had named or acknowledged was quietly, without fanfare, without any grand declaration, beginning to take root. The way things do in the spaces between the words. In the accumulated weight of small truths and the particular silence of two people who have both been alone for a long time, and have both, independently, begun to notice the difference. The weeks turned without ceremony, the way time does on a working ranch where the hours are measured in tasks rather than clocks. And Eleanor Whitaker stopped counting the days somewhere around the third week, because counting days was what you did when you were waiting for something to end, and she had quietly, almost without noticing, stopped waiting for this to end. She had started waiting for what came next instead. That was a different thing entirely. The ranch had its rhythms, and she had found her place inside them. Mornings, she made breakfast, real breakfast, the kind that required time and attention, not the scraps she'd assembled for herself in the margins of the Mercer kitchen. Silas came in from the barn with hay on his coat and creek water still on his hands, and he ate without performing a to gratitude which she had come to understand was his particular form of respect. Because performing gratitude meant treating a thing like a gift, when what she was offering was simply herself, her competence, her presence. He ate the way a man eats who has spent 10 years feeding himself adequately and is now experiencing the difference between adequate and good, with a focused attention that said more than words would have. After breakfast he worked, she worked. They moved around each other through the mornings, with the ease of two people who have learned each other's patterns without sitting down to learn them. She knew he would need the kitchen for his water jug before 9. He knew she would be in the garden until the heat peaked and would want the shade of the porch after. They exchanged information efficiently and without friction. They told each other the truth. These were, Eleanor had discovered, rarer qualities in a person than you'd think. The garden was thriving. She had put in marigolds along the front fence because she had read once that they kept the insects off the vegetables. And also because they were the color of late afternoon, and she had missed having color that wasn't earned by someone else's permission. The tomatoes had come back strong after she staked them. There were beans and squash and a row of carrots that were still small but coming. She had found a patch of mint growing wild near the well, and transplanted a section of it near the back door, and the whole house smelled of it on warm evenings when the air moved through. Silas had looked at the marigolds on a Tuesday morning without comment. On Wednesday morning he said, "My mother used to grow those." "Did she?" Eleanor said, "along every fence she had." He was quiet for a moment, looking at them. "Haven't seen them growing here in a long time." Eleanor didn't say anything. Some things didn't need a response. That was the Tuesday and Wednesday of the fourth week. By Thursday, something had shifted, and she could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the cloud arrives in the quality of the air, in a certain accumulated pressure. She found out why on Thursday evening. She had been inside making supper when she heard a horse coming fast up the north road, not Pritchard's cautious approach, not the easy pace of a neighbor fast, the way a rider comes when they're carrying news that can't wait. She went to the window and saw a young man she didn't recognize pull up in the yard, and Silas came from the barn to meet him. And the conversation that followed was short and sharp and ended with the young man handing Silas a folded paper for turning his horse back the way he'd come. Silas stood in the yard holding the paper. He read it once. He stood very still for a moment, in a way she had come to understand meant something was serious. Then he came inside. He put the paper on the table. "Sit down, unkindly. Just direct." Eleanor sat. He sat across from her, and he looked at her with the particular steadiness she had come to trust, the look that said whatever he was about to say he had already thought through, and she was going to get the plain version of it. "Calvin's filed papers with the county court," he said, "claiming you are mentally incompetent and therefore cannot be held responsible for the decision to leave the Mercer household. Claiming that your presence on this property is the result of, and I'm quoting now, undue influence from a person of questionable moral character." Eleanor looked at the paper. She didn't touch it. "He's petitioning to have me returned. He's petitioning to have a hearing. Whether to return you is what the hearing would decide." He paused. "But a hearing means a judge, and a judge means this moves out of Pritchard's hands, which is good, except that it also means it becomes official record, and the Mercer family has enough money to make official records say interesting things." "When is the hearing?" 2 weeks. Eleanor sat with that. 2 weeks was not much time. 2 weeks was enough time for Calvin to build a narrative, call witnesses, find anyone in Willow Creek who had ever seen Eleanor look confused or frightened, which was anyone who had seen her at all in the last 3 years. Since confusion and fear had been her baseline state, and present it to a judge who had never met her as evidence that she was not in possession of her own mind. She knew this because she had watched Calvin build narratives before. She had watched him do it to other people. She had watched him construct a version of events so seamlessly that the people inside those events sometimes began to doubt their own memories. "He's good at this," she said. "He is," Silas agreed. "You knew he might try something like this." "I knew he'd try something," he said. "Legal was always a possibility. It's cleaner for him than sending men in the night. Leaves less for people to talk about." Eleanor looked at her hands flat on the table. "If the hearing goes his way, it won't. You can't know that." "No," he said, "but I can know that I'll fight it with everything I have." He held her gaze. "I want to be clear with you. I'm not going to let them take you back to that house, Eleanor. I'll spend every dollar I have on lawyers before I let that happen. But I want you to know what's coming, so you can be part of deciding how we fight it." She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them threw his face into relief, the strong jaw, the dark eyes, the particular quality of resolution she had come to think of as simply him. A man who had decided a thing and meant it. "We," she said. "We," he repeated, flat and certain. Something happened in her chest that she didn't entirely have language for. It wasn't gratitude. She was past the place where what he offered could be reduced to gratitude. It was something more fundamental. The particular impact of being included in a fight that concerned you as a participant rather than a subject. "What do we need?" "Witnesses," he said. "People who saw what happened in that store. People who can speak to your character." And he paused, picked up his coffee and set it down again. "Ideally, someone who can speak to what your life was actually like in that house." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "The women who worked there before me," she said slowly. "Calvin went through 3 housekeepers in the 5 years before I came. I heard Martha complain about them. 1 was dismissed. The other 2 left." She met his eyes. "I never knew why." "Think they might talk?" "I don't know," she said. "I don't know if they stayed in the area. I don't know if they'd be willing to, it cost something, to say things out loud about the Mercer family." "You know that." "I know it," he said, "but I also know that people who've been waiting for a reason sometimes take one when it's offered." He paused. "Margaret Hale said she'd speak for you. She told me so directly in town." Eleanor stared. "Margaret Hale. She said she's been ashamed of herself for 2 years and she's done being ashamed." He said it simply. Her words. Eleanor pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry in front of him again. The first time had been private, had been necessary, had been earned. This was a different kind of thing. This was something that happened when you discover that people have been watching with more care than they allowed themselves to show. Reverend Aldous too, Silas said. He told me he spoke to Calvin once, early on, and Calvin made a donation and the Reverend let it go, and he's been carrying that. He wants to set it down. Everyone wants to set things down, Eleanor said quietly, when someone else has already lifted them. Silas looked at her. That bother you? She thought about it honestly, which was the only kind of thinking she did with him. It should, probably, but mostly it means something. That they're willing now. She paused. People are complicated. They are, he agreed. He looked at her for a moment. His expression was doing the thing it sometimes did in the evenings, something that moved just beneath the surface of his composure. Not restless, but present. As if there was something there that he had not yet decided what to do with. What are you thinking? She said. He looked slightly surprised that she'd asked. Most people, she had noticed, did not ask Silas Beaumont what he was thinking. They waited to see what he decided to say. I'm thinking, he said, that you've changed. She raised her eyebrows. In a month. He looked at her steadily. When you got off that wagon in Willow Creek, you walked with your shoulders compressed. Like you were trying to take up less space than your body naturally does. He paused. You don't walk that way anymore. Eleanor looked down at her hands. She turned them over, looked at her palms. I didn't know you noticed things like that. I notice most things, he said. I just don't always say them. Why are you saying it now? He was quiet for a moment. Because in 2 weeks you're going to stand in front of a judge, and people are going to try to make you small again, he said. And I want you to remember that you stopped walking that way. On your own, without anyone telling you to. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with a dry, whispering sound, and somewhere across the yard one of the horses shifted in the barn. Eleanor looked at Silas Beaumont across the table, at the man who had said one decent thing on a Tuesday morning and had not stopped since, and she thought about the question she had been turning over for weeks, the one she hadn't let herself look at directly, the way you don't look directly at the sun, and she let herself look at it now. She was falling in love with him. Not the starving love of a person who mistakes kindness for devotion, because they have been without kindness for so long they cannot tell the difference. She had been careful about that. She had watched herself for it, suspicious of her own heart, knowing the particular vulnerability of someone who has been in the dark and suddenly has light pointed at them. But what she felt was specific. It was built from known things. From the way he held open doors without making it a performance. From the way he told her the truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable. From the particular quality of his silences, which she had come to trust more than most people's words. From the moment with Pritchard, when he had stood at the corner of the barn, available, and had not intervened, because he had seen that she did not need him to, and had trusted that completely. You could love a man for that, for the specific, practiced trust of that. She was not going to tell him. Not now, not yet. They had a hearing to get through and a fight to win, and what lived in her chest was hers to manage until the time was right for something other than managing. But she knew. She looked down at her hands and she knew. All right, she said. Then let's figure out how to fight this. The next 2 weeks were the most concentrated and deliberate of Eleanor's life. Silas found a lawyer, a sharp, impatient man named Aldous Crane, who rode out from Billings with a leather case full of papers, and a manner that suggested he had very little time for people who confused legal procedure with actual justice. He was not warm, he was not reassuring. He was, however, clearly excellent at what he did, and he looked at Eleanor across the kitchen table on his first visit and said, "Tell me everything. Start with the day you arrived at the Mercer house, and don't leave anything out." She told him everything. It took 2 hours. Silas sat across the table through all of it and did not say anything. Did not reach for her hand or offer any of the small gestures of comfort she might have expected. He simply sat there the way a wall sits solid, present, making the room feel safer without doing anything in particular. She felt it, the way you feel the presence of something reliable. She kept her voice steady through most of it and lost it briefly at one point, talking about the first winter. How she had gotten sick with a fever and Martha had refused to call a doctor and had simply told her that sick people who lay in bed were useless and she could get back up or get out, and she pressed her lips together hard and got it back. Crane made notes. When she finished, he looked at his papers for a long moment. "They're going to put their older son on the stand," he said. "Thomas. He'll say he never witnessed any mistreatment. That you were treated like family, that the departure was sudden and out of character and consistent with emotional instability." "It wasn't out of character," Eleanor said. "It was the first time in 3 years anyone offered me a way out." "I know that," Crane said. "The questions making a judge know it." He looked at her. "Can you do this? Take the stand and say all of it out loud in a room with them sitting 10 feet from you." Eleanor thought about Martha Mercer's face in Mitchell's store. About Calvin's voice at the funeral, quiet and specific, making sure only she could hear it. About 3 years of making herself small. "Yes," she said. Crane looked at Silas. "6 confirmed," Silas said. Margaret Hale, Reverend Aldous, Tom Wicker from the livery he saw Mercer push Eleanor in the street last February. His wife, and 2 women who worked at the Mercer ranch before Eleanor came. Eleanor turned to look at him. "You found them?" "Crane found them," Silas said. "He's good at finding people." Crane looked at his papers without false modesty. "One still lives in the county, the other is 2 towns over." Both agreed to speak. He looked up at Eleanor. Both of them had stories. She closed her eyes briefly. Of course they did. Of course they did. And they had been carrying them alone, the same way she had carried hers. "All right," she said. "One more thing," Crane said. He turned to Silas. "Calvin is going to come after you. Personally. He's going to make the argument that this is a man who took advantage of a vulnerable woman, for reasons the court can speculate about. I need you on that stand clean as a whistle. No business disputes with anyone in the county. No debts, nothing that lets them paint a picture." "No debts," Silas said. "No disputes. My books are open. Land deed is solid title. Paid in full 6 years ago." Crane nodded. Looked at them both with the narrow, assessing expression of a man who has seen a great number of people come through his office, claiming to be in the right. "I believe you have a case," he said, which was clearly the highest form of enthusiasm available to him. He left before supper. Eleanor and Silas sat at the table after he'd gone. 6 witnesses, she said. 6, he confirmed. "Where did Tom Wicker come from? I didn't know he saw that." "He came to me," Silas said, "after word got around about the hearing. He said he'd been feeling bad about not speaking up when it happened. Said he'd seen Calvin shove you into the wall outside the feed store, and he'd just kept walking." His jaw tightened slightly. "He wants to make it right." Eleanor thought about the invisible weight of that, all those moments, all those people who had seen and looked away and then gone home, and felt the particular discomfort of having chosen wrong. She had spent 3 years believing the town had simply decided she didn't matter. She had not imagined that some of them had decided that, and then kept living with what that felt like. "People are complicated," she said again. "Seems to be the truth of it," Silas agreed. She looked at him, at the strong, still face, at the hands on the table, rough from years of work and currently wrapped around a coffee cup with the same loose, unguarded ease he brought to most things. "Are you scared?" she said. He thought about it, genuinely. "Not for myself," he said. "For you. I'm scared they'll put you through something difficult, and I know you can handle it. I've watched you handle things I'm not sure I could. But knowing you can handle it doesn't mean I want you to have to." Eleanor looked at him. She thought, this is what it is. This is what it looks like when someone is afraid for you and not of you. This is the thing I didn't know to miss because I never had it. "I'll be all right," she said. "I know you will," he said. And the certainty in it was the same certainty as always, not the performative reassurance of someone trying to make a feeling go away, but the flat, factual assessment of a man who has watched her and drawn a conclusion. She believed it because he believed it. That was something she would think about later, after the light had gone and she was in her room with the latch on, in the particular quiet that had become hers. She would think about the way trust, when it moves between 2 people long enough, starts to travel in both directions. The way you can borrow someone's certainty and hold it until you've grown your own. The night before the hearing, Eleanor could not sleep. She lay in the narrow bed and watched the ceiling and listed facts the way Crane had taught her, just the facts. Chronological, specific, no interpretations that could be disputed. She had done it so many times in the last 2 weeks that the sequence had worn smooth in her mind, a path she could walk in the dark without stumbling. But the part that couldn't be made into a fact, the part she couldn't prepare for, was the moment of walking into that room and seeing Calvin and Martha Mercer sitting there. Looking at the faces of people who had spent 3 years making her believe she was nothing, and having to stand in front of a judge and say, "I am something. I was always something, and I know it now." She heard a sound in the kitchen. She listened. It was the sound of someone sitting down carefully in the chair that creaked, the chair near the window, which was Silas's chair. He was up. She lay still for a moment. Then she got up, put her shawl around her shoulders, and went out. He was sitting in the chair with a cup of something coffee, probably cold, and he looked up when she came in without surprise. As if some part of him had known she would. "Couldn't sleep either," she said. "Never sleep well before something important," he said. "Never have." She sat down across from him. Outside the window the sky was very dark and very full of stars. "Tell me about Clara," she said. He looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not pain exactly, the quality of something that has been grieved completely and become simply true. "She was funny," he said. "That's the first thing I always think when I think about her. She was the funniest person I ever knew." Had this way of saying something so perfectly plain that it became hilarious. He paused. "She was from Missouri. She had opinions about everything, and she told them to you directly. I loved that about her." "You must have been very happy," Eleanor said quietly. "We were," he said. 2 years. We had 2 good years." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "After she died, I made myself into someone who didn't need much. It seemed like the safest thing. And now," Eleanor said. He looked at her. The question sat between them, and it was a larger question than it appeared, and they both knew it. "Now," he said slowly, "I'm not sure safe is the right measure for things anymore." Eleanor held his gaze. Her heart was doing something complicated. "Silas," she said carefully. "I know," he said even more carefully. "I don't think she started again. We have a hearing in 7 hours, and I think we should probably not." "Agreed," he said. "Completely agreed," she said. They sat in the dark kitchen with the stars outside and the cold coffee between them and something entirely unfinished in the air, and they did not say another word about it. They just sat, the way people sit when there is something true between them that has been acknowledged without being opened, and the acknowledging alone is enough to make the room feel different. After a while Silas said, "You should sleep, even a few hours." "You too," she said. "I will." He didn't move. She didn't move either. They sat there a little longer. Then she went back to her room and lay down, and this time she slept. The courtroom in Willow Creek was a single room at the back of the county building, not much larger than a generous parlor, with 3 rows of benches and a judge's table at the front that was more functional than imposing. Judge Harold Marsh had a reputation as a precise and fair man who had no patience for politics or social performance, and when he entered the room that morning, he looked at everyone assembled there with the same flat, measured regard, no favoritism. No evident predispositions, just a man who intended to hear what was said and decide accordingly. Calvin sat at one table with a lawyer. Eleanor didn't recognize someone from outside the county, someone he had paid well. Calvin was wearing his best coat and his most responsible expression, the public face she had spent 3 years watching him deploy. Martha sat behind him in the benches, dressed in sober colors, with the practiced expression of a woman grievously wronged. Thomas Mercer sat beside his mother. He didn't look at Eleanor. Eleanor sat with Crane and Silas on the other side. She had put on her best dress, the blue one, cleaned the night before and pressed carefully, and she had done her hair properly, and she sat with her back straight and her hands still in her lap, and she did not look at the Mercer table. She looked at the judge. She had decided during the 2-hour ride into town that she was going to look at the judge. She was going to keep her eyes on the person who mattered, not on the people trying to reduce her. Calvin's lawyer went first. He was good. Eleanor had known he would be good. He was a smooth, careful man with a low voice and an air of reluctant sorrow, as if all of this pained him deeply and he was only doing his duty. He spoke about Eleanor's arrival at the Mercer household, her grief over her husband, her instability in the difficult period following his death. He spoke about the family's generosity in providing her shelter and support. He spoke about the suddenness of her departure, the concerning nature of it. He spoke about Silas. He used the words undue influence. He used them several times. He implied, without ever quite stating it directly, that a lonely woman in a distressed state of mind was not in a position to make clear decisions when a man had shown her attention. Eleanor kept her eyes on the judge. Crane went next. He was not smooth. He was precise. He presented the facts in order: Eleanor's years at the ranch, the debt used as leverage, the documented history of the previous housekeepers who were present and would testify. He called Margaret Hale, who stood up with a directness that surprised Eleanor, and said simply that she had watched Martha Mercer humiliate Eleanor in public on more than a dozen occasions and had failed to say anything, and was saying it now. She named specific dates. She had written them in her diary, she said, and produced the diary, and the date of the incident in Mitchell's store matched exactly. Calvin's lawyer objected. The judge overruled him. Tom Wicker testified to the shove outside the feed store. The first former housekeeper, a woman in her 40s named Ruth Hensley, with a steady voice and no detectable fear, testified to 18 months of work at the Mercer Ranch, the specific cruelties she had witnessed, and the specific threat that Calvin had made to her reputation when she tried to leave. By the time Reverend Aldous stood and said publicly that he had failed Eleanor Whitaker once and asked for her forgiveness, the room had the quality of a space in which something irrevocable was happening. Then Crane called Eleanor. She walked to the stand. She sat down. She looked at the judge. Calvin's lawyer came toward her with the expression of a man who has spent years reducing people on witness stands and knows exactly how to do it. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said pleasantly, "would you say you were in a distressed emotional state when you left the Mercer household?" "No," she said, "I was afraid. There's a difference between distress and fear. Distress is confusion. Fear is a rational response to a real threat." A small sound from the benches. The lawyer's expression flickered. "And yet you made a significant life decision," he said, "in the company of a man you had only just met." "I made a significant life decision," she said, "when someone offered me one. Someone who stood to benefit from my what?" she said. Her voice was perfectly level. "Complete absence of money, my lack of property, what exactly does he stand to benefit from?" A longer silence. "Your presence on his property could be argued to." "I work," Eleanor said. "I cook and tend the garden and mend clothes." If he wanted free labor, I think a man with a working ranch could have found it cheaper than building a legal case against Calvin Mercer. A murmur from the benches. "What he offered me was a room with a latch on the inside of the door, which I needed, because in 3 years in the Mercer household I had never once slept through the night feeling safe." The lawyer paused. He looked at his papers. He recalibrated. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, in a different tone, "can you tell me about your husband Daniel's debt?" "The debt that changed depending on what they needed it to accomplish," she said. "I can tell you that the figure Calvin quoted Mr. Beaumont in Mitchell's general store was higher than the figure he quoted me in December of last year and lower than the figure his wife cited to the Reverend's wife in March. I can also tell you that I have never been shown any documentation of this debt. Not once in 3 years." Crane at the table was writing something without looking up, but she could see the set of his shoulders.
Calvin's lawyer asked 2 more questions.
They were shorter questions than the first ones. Then he sat down. Crane stood. He asked Eleanor one question. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "if the court were to rule in the Mercer family's favor today, what would happen to you?" She looked at the judge. "I'd go back to a house where I slept with a chair under the door handle," she said, "where I ate what was left after everyone else was finished, where I was called useless and stupid and worse on a daily basis, in public and in private, and where I was told regularly that there was nowhere else for me, and no one who would believe me if I spoke." She paused. and I would go back knowing that I had stood up in a courtroom and told the truth, and the truth hadn't mattered. She paused once more. "But I don't think that's what's going to happen," she said. The judge looked at her over his papers, and something in his expression, not warm, not soft, but specific and deliberate, said that she was right. Calvin Mercer stood to testify, and for the first time in Eleanor's memory, he looked like a man who was not entirely sure of his own ground. He was good on the stand she had known he would be. He had the rancher's ease with public speech, the authority of a man who has spent decades being listened to. He talked about Eleanor's place in his household, his family's generosity, his concern for her well-being. He made it all sound very reasonable. He made 3 years of her life sound like an extended act of charity that she had unfortunately misinterpreted. He was credible, he was practiced, and then Crane stood up. "Mr. Mercer," Crane said pleasantly, "can you tell the court the amount of debt that Mrs. Whitaker owed your household at the time she left?" Calvin named a figure. It was the figure from the store. Crane produced a piece of paper. He read the figure Calvin had cited to Reverend Aldous' wife in March. He read the figure from December. He read a third figure from a letter Calvin had written to a business partner in January, making a passing reference to Eleanor's debt as leverage in a separate negotiation. 3 different numbers, 3 different contexts. All of them documented. The courtroom was very quiet. Calvin looked at his lawyer. His lawyer looked at his papers. Judge Marsh looked at Calvin Mercer with the expression of a man who has just seen something click into place. "Mr. Mercer," Marsh said, not waiting for Crane, "I'd like you to tell me which of those 3 figures is the accurate one." And for the first time in Eleanor's experience, the first time in 3 years of watching Calvin Mercer move through the world with the absolute assurance of a man who was never required to answer for anything she watched him, have nothing to say. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it was the loudest silence Eleanor had ever heard. Judge Marsh did not make them wait. He had the particular quality of a man who forms conclusions quickly and has enough experience to trust them, and when he called the room to order after a 30-minute recess, he did not deliver a speech. He read his ruling in the flat, precise language of a man who considers legal decisions to be statements of fact rather than performances, and the facts he stated were these. The petition filed by Calvin Mercer was dismissed in its entirety. Eleanor Whitaker was a woman of sound mind and full legal agency who had made a voluntary and defensible decision to leave a household in which she had been subjected to documented mistreatment. The matter of the debt was referred for separate investigation, as the inconsistent figures presented under oath constituted grounds for further inquiry. And finally, Marsh said this last part, with the careful, deliberate tone of a man who wants to be clearly understood any future attempt to interfere with Mrs. Whitaker's freedom of movement or residence would be treated by this court as harassment and addressed accordingly. He set down his papers. He looked at Calvin Mercer. Calvin sat very still, and then it was over. The room broke into sound the way rooms do when something large has shifted, not celebration exactly, more like the collective exhale of people who have been holding their breath for longer than they realized. Margaret Hale reached across the bench and pressed Eleanor's arm. Reverend Aldous closed his eyes briefly, with the expression of a man setting something down. Ruth Hensley, the former housekeeper, sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the judge's empty table with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has waited a long time to see a particular thing happen. Eleanor sat completely still. She had prepared herself in the days leading up to the hearing for many things. She had prepared for the ruling to go wrong. She had prepared for Calvin to find some procedural angle she hadn't anticipated. She had prepared, in her most honest moments, for the possibility that 3 years of documented suffering would be weighed against Calvin Mercer's land and reputation and money, and found somehow insufficient. She had not, she realized, fully prepared for it to simply be over. Crane was beside her, saying something about next steps, about the debt investigation, about a follow-up filing he would manage from Billings. She heard his words without quite processing them. Silas was on her other side, and he was not touching her, and he was not speaking, and he was, as always, in the ways that mattered simply there. Present, making the space around her feel solid, Mrs. Whitaker, Crane said Eleanor. She turned to look at him. We won, he said, plainly, because he was a plain man. Yes, she said. Are you all right? She thought about the question. It was the same question Silas had asked her in Mitchell's General Store on a Tuesday morning that felt like it belonged to someone else's life now. The same words, an entirely different weight behind them. I will be, she said. Yes, across the room, Calvin Mercer was standing. His lawyer had his hand on Calvin's arm and was speaking quietly to him, and Calvin was listening with the closed, rigid expression of a man performing composure because the alternative was not available to him in a public room. Martha sat behind him in the benches, and she was looking at Eleanor, with an expression that Eleanor had seen before, stripped of its social coating, stripped of the warmth on the surface performance, and what was underneath was not rage. It was something older and smaller than rage. Martha Mercer looked, for the first time in Eleanor's experience, like a woman who was afraid. Eleanor looked at her for a moment, then she looked away. She didn't need it. She had thought, sometimes, in the worst of the 3 years, that she would want this moment, the moment when the balance shifted, when the power that had been held over her was taken away. She had thought she would want to see their faces, when it happened. But what she found, sitting in that courtroom with the ruling still warm in the air, was that she didn't want anything from them at all. Not acknowledgement, not understanding, not even an apology she knew they would never give. She was done wanting things from the Mercer family. She was done letting their existence be the measure of her own. She stood up. Silas stood up beside her. They walked out of the courtroom together, into the bright hard light of the Montana afternoon, and Eleanor stopped on the steps and let the sun hit her face and breathed. You all right? He said quietly, beside her. You keep asking me that, she said. Keep seeming relevant, he said. She looked at him. The sun was in her eyes and she squinted against it, and she thought, not for the first time, that this was a man she could look for a very long time without wanting to look away. I'm good, she said. I'm genuinely good. Something crossed his face that she was beginning to learn the particular softening that happened at the edges of his composure, when something reached him, when something mattered. Carefully controlled but not quite fully controlled, because he was a human being and not a stone wall. Good, he said. They stood on the steps. Behind them, the door opened, and Margaret Hale came out and took Eleanor's hands in both of hers and said, I am so glad, with a simplicity and a weight that made the words mean exactly as much as they should. Thank you, Eleanor said, for speaking, for coming. I should have spoken 2 years ago, Margaret said. I know that, but I'm here now. You're here now, Eleanor agreed. That matters. Reverend Aldous came out after and said something appropriate and kind, and Eleanor received it with the graciousness of a woman who has decided not to require more from people than what they are capable of giving. Ruth Hensley shook her hand firmly and said, I hope that's the last time any of us see the inside of that room for that particular reason, and Eleanor said, so do I, and meant it. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Not the careful, testing quiet of the first ride out of Willow Creek that felt like 100 years ago, like something that had happened to an earlier version of herself, but the quiet of two people who are tired in the good way. The way of people who have done something difficult and done it well. Silas drove. She sat beside him. After a while she said, the debt investigation. Crane will handle it, he said. Do you think anything will come of it? He was quiet for a moment. Depends on how deep the judge wants to go. Calvin's had his fingers in a lot of arrangements over the years. The debt thing is just the one that got documented in a courtroom today. He paused. But that's not your problem to carry anymore. It still feels like it is. I know, he said. That feeling takes time. She looked at the road ahead of them. How long did it take you, after Clara, to stop feeling like the loss was still your problem to carry? He thought about it for so long she thought he might not answer. Then some of it I still carry, he said, but it changed shape. There's a difference between carrying something because it's yours and carrying something because you haven't figured out yet how to set it down. He paused. The second kind that one goes, eventually, if you let it. Eleanor nodded. They rode after another mile or so, she said. I want to plant something. When we get back, he glanced at her sideways. Tonight? Not tonight, tomorrow. I want to put in something new. Something that wasn't there before all of this. Something I plant after. He didn't ask after what. He understood after. What are you thinking, he said. Lavender, she said, along the front of the house. If the soil's right for it, it's right for it, he said. I've seen it grow out here, takes to the dry summers. Good, she said, then lavender, he nodded once. I'll get the starts next time I'm in town. She looked at him. He had said it with such complete unself-conscious matter-of-factness. I'll get the starts, as if the lavender she wanted to plant along the front of his house was a thing that simply belonged in the category of things he would take care of. As if her wanting it was sufficient reason for it to happen. She looked at him for a long moment. He kept his eyes on the road. Silas, she said. What you said last night. In the kitchen, he was quiet. About not being sure safe is the right measure for things anymore, she said. The wagon went over a small rut and settled. I remember what I said, he said carefully. I want you to know that she stopped, organized herself. I have been very deliberate about not mistaking one thing for another. About making sure that what I feel is what I think it is, and not just the first warmth after a very long cold, she paused. I've been careful about that. I know you have, he said. And I'm telling you, she said, that I've been careful. And she stopped again. He turned and looked at her. Eleanor, he said, I'm not very good at this, she said. I haven't had much practice with this particular kind of conversation. Neither have I, he said. You could help, she said. The corner of his mouth moved, just barely. I could, he said. He looked back at the road. He was quiet for a moment that felt very long. There's something I want to say to you, he said finally. And I've been trying to find the right time for it, and I kept deciding there wasn't a right time. But I think the right time might just be a thing that doesn't arrive on its own. Usually doesn't, she agreed. He took a breath, let it out. When I went to Willow Creek that Tuesday morning, he said, I wasn't looking for anything. I was there for a feed order, that's it. I had spent 10 years not looking for anything and being fairly comfortable with that. He paused. And then I walked into that store and I saw he stopped. His jaw tightened slightly, the way it did when he was working through something precise. I saw a woman who had been made to believe she was invisible. And something happened in me that I haven't been able to undo since. Eleanor said nothing. I told myself it was just doing right, he said. Just the decent thing. I told myself that for about 2 weeks. The corner of his mouth moved again. Then I ran out of ways to tell myself that. What did you replace it with? She said quietly. He looked at her. The truth, he said. The wagon rolled on. The horse moved at its easy, patient pace. I'd like to know, Eleanor said carefully, what the truth is. The truth, he said, is that you are the most remarkable person I have met in a very long time. And I am not saying that because you've had a hard time. Plenty of people have hard times, and it doesn't make them remarkable. I'm saying it because of how you handled Pritchard in the yard. Because of what you said on that witness stand today. Because of the way you make coffee so strong it could wake a dead man, and the way you don't say thank you when it's not warranted, and the way you put the potatoes back up without anyone asking you to. He paused. And because when you actually laugh, it sounds like you invented the idea. Eleanor's throat was tight. She looked at the road. That, she said, is the most words I have ever heard you say at one time. Been saving them, he said, drier than she expected, and then she laughed. And he looked at her sideways with the barely contained thing behind his composure, and the afternoon opened around them. I love you, she said simply, because she was done being careful with it. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. She waited. I love you too, he said. Deliberate, true. She nodded. He nodded. They rode in silence for a while, and it was not any kind of silence she had ever experienced before, not the silence of a threat, not the silence of absence, not even the peaceable silence of two people who have run out of things to say. It was the silence of two people who have said the important thing and are now simply inside the truth of it, together, with the road going on ahead of them. They were nearly back to the ranch when he said, "I want to do this properly." She glanced at him. "What do you mean, properly?" "I mean," he said, "that when the time is right, when you've had time to settle into what your life is now, without the hearing, and without the Mercers, and without any of it, I want to ask you something." She looked at him. "Ask me now." He shook his head. "Not yet. Not yet," he said again. "You just got your freedom today. I'm not going to ask you to sign over another piece of your life on the same afternoon." He looked at her. "You deserve time to live in what you've got before you take on anything else." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. This, she thought. This precise, careful, stubborn decency. This was what it felt like. "All right," she said. "Then I'll wait." "You don't have to wait long," he said. "I know," she said. "I've got good things to do while I wait." "The lavender," he said. "The lavender," she agreed. He pulled the wagon through the gate of the Beaumont ranch, and the horse slowed to its familiar pace heading toward the barn. And Eleanor sat beside Silas with the long Montana afternoon stretching ahead of them, and something wide and possible in her chest, and she thought about lavender along the front of a house, and about what it meant to plant something after. The days that followed were different, not because the circumstances had changed dramatically. The work was the same. The rhythms were the same. The ranch needed what it always needed, but because something in the air between them had been named. And named things take up space differently than unnamed ones. They moved around each other with the same practical ease as before, and also with a new, quiet awareness that was not uncomfortable but was impossible to ignore entirely. The way a window you've looked through 100 times is suddenly different once someone has told you what's on the other side of it. He brought her the lavender starts 4 days after the hearing. He came back from a supply run into the next town over, and there was a flat of small gray-green plants in the back of the wagon, and he did not make anything of it, just set them near the garden and said, "Ground still warm enough to plant," and went to stable the horse. Eleanor stood and looked at the lavender for a moment. Then she planted it. It took most of the afternoon, working carefully along the front of the house, measuring the spacing with her hand, pressing each small plant in with the particular attention she brought to things she wanted to last. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and looked at the row of them, small now, unimpressive now, but she could see what they would be in a year, in 2 years, the gray-silver spread of them, the scent of them in the summer heat. Silas came and stood at the porch rail above her. He looked at the lavender. He looked at her. "Good," he said. She looked up at him. The afternoon light was at his back, and she had to shade her eyes with her hand, and she thought, "I will remember this exact moment. I will remember the light and the smell of the turned earth, and this precise, unelaborate man looking at something I made and calling it good." "Yes," she said, "it is." Something was coming. She could feel it, not something bad. For the first time in her memory, the thing she felt approaching was not dread, but its opposite. The particular anticipation of someone who has begun to trust that what comes next might be worth having. But what arrived first was trouble, because Calvin Mercer was not finished. She should have known. She had known, in the way of people who have studied a particular kind of man for 3 years and understand his instincts. Calvin did not accept defeat. He repackaged it. He found a different angle. The hearing had cost him more than the ruling it had cost him, in the way that mattered most to a man like Calvin, which was reputation, community standing, the quiet social authority that a man in his position spent decades building and could lose in a courtroom afternoon. He had lost it, and he blamed Eleanor. Not entirely, he blamed Silas too, and Crane, and Judge Marsh, and probably Ruth Hensley and Margaret Hale and every person who had spoken in that room, but Eleanor was the one whose existence had started it. And Calvin had spent 3 years telling himself a story in which Eleanor's suffering was not suffering at all, in which what he and Martha had done was simply the management of a difficult and ungrateful woman. And that story did not end cleanly with the judge's ruling. He needed it to end differently. He started with the land. A week after the hearing, Silas came in from town with a specific kind of stillness, About him, not the deliberate stillness of a man thinking, but the particular tightness of a man holding something in. Eleanor looked at him across the kitchen. "What happened?" she said. He set his hat on the table. "Calvin's been talking to Garrett Moore." Garrett Moore owned the largest piece of land adjacent to the Beaumont Ranch. He was not a bad man. Eleanor had met him twice. A quiet rancher with a large family and straightforward views, but he was a practical one. And practical men in a small county were susceptible to pressure from the most powerful family in that county. Talking to him about what? Eleanor said. The water access, Silas said. The creek that runs through the north corner of my property crosses a piece of Moore's land first. There's been a handshake agreement between Moore and me for 8 years about water rights. He paused. Calvin is suggesting to Moore that he formalize the arrangement. Make it legal. Charge for the access. Eleanor sat down. Which would cost you more than I'm willing to pay if he sets the price right, Silas said. And during a dry summer without that water, the north pasture is not workable. Eleanor looked at her hands on the table. He can't take me back through the courts, she said. So he's going after what matters to you. That's it, Silas said. He wants you to tell me to leave, she said. He wants to make this cost enough that you do it yourself so he doesn't have to. Silas looked at her with the dark, steady eyes. I know what he wants. And in nothing, he said. I'm not going to do it. Silas, Eleanor. He said her name the way he sometimes did, not sharp, not loud, just direct, like a hand pressed flat against something to stop its movement. I'm not going to do it. That's not a discussion. It should be a discussion, she said. If this ranch... The ranch is fine, he said. I'm going to talk to Moore directly. Without Calvin in the room. Garrett Moore and I have known each other for 8 years, and I have more faith in him than Calvin is counting on. He paused. And if I'm wrong about that, we'll figure out what comes next. Together. The word together landed the way it always did, not dramatic, not performed, just there. Solid and meant. I hate that he's doing this, Eleanor said. I know, I hate that my being here is stopped, Silas said. Not unkindly. You being here is not the problem. Calvin Mercer's character is the problem. Don't take his work and put it on yourself. She looked at him. He was right. She knew he was right. It still took her a moment to accept it, because 3 years of being told you are the cause of every problem cannot undo itself in a courtroom ruling or a month and a half on a ranch with lavender growing along the front of the house. It undoes itself slowly, in small moments, every time someone names the truth plainly and holds it steady until you can see it for yourself. All right, she said. All right, he agreed. He went to see Garrett Moore the next morning. He came back at midday. Eleanor heard the wagon and came out to the porch, and she could read his face from 20 yards away. Now she had learned his face the way you learn terrain. By moving through it repeatedly until you know where the flat ground is and where it drops. He was calm, not relieved calm, just settled. What did he say? She called. Silas tied up the horse, said. Calvin came to him. Twice, he said, coming toward the porch. First time he listened. Second time he told Calvin the handshake agreement wasn't changing and to take his business elsewhere. He came up the steps. Said he'd been hearing from his wife about the hearing and he had no interest in being Calvin Mercer's instrument. Eleanor let out a breath. His wife, she said. Women who see things, Silas said, and the dry, private thing moved across his face. She laughed. He looked at her. The afternoon opened around them. He's not going to stop, Eleanor said when she had caught her breath. Calvin, he's going to keep finding angles. Probably, Silas said. For a while. How do we keep living like this, waiting for the next thing? Silas leaned against the porch rail and looked at her with the expression of a man who has thought about this already, who thought about most things before they became necessary to discuss. We don't wait, he said. We just live, and when the next thing comes, we deal with it. Same as we've been doing. That's simple, she said. That's simple, he said. Hard but simple. She looked at him. He looked back. You were going to ask me something, she said. You said when the time was right. He straightened slightly. I said you needed time. I've had time, she said. It's been 6 weeks. 6 weeks is not nothing, she said. I know myself. I have always known myself. The Mercers tried very hard to make me doubt that, but they didn't succeed. She held his gaze. I know what I want. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the marigolds along the fence. The lavender along the front of the house was too young to smell yet, but it would be. Eleanor Whitaker, he said, and his voice was lower than usual, careful with the weight of it. I am not a man who offers things he doesn't mean. So I want you to understand that if I ask you this, I mean every part of it, and I have thought about it more than I have thought about almost anything. I understand that, she said. I am asking you, he said, to let this be yours. This place, this life, not because you have nowhere else to go, you have somewhere else to go. I'll make sure of that. You have choices now. That's the whole point, but because you want to be here. Because I want you here. Because the last 6 weeks have been the best 6 weeks I have had in 10 years, and I would very much like to see what the next 10 years look like with you in them. Eleanor looked at him, the direct, unbeautiful, completely honest face of a man who does not perform and does not pretend. Is that a proposal, she said? It's the beginning of one, he said. I've got a ring. I ordered it from Billings 3 weeks ago. It came in yesterday. He paused. I was going to wait longer. You don't have to wait longer, she said. He reached into his coat. The ring was simple, a narrow band with a single small stone, not flashy. Not expensive, exactly the thing a man like Silas would choose because it was honest and it would last and it did not try to be something it wasn't. He held it out. Eleanor looked at it. She thought about a Tuesday morning in a general store. She thought about a wagon rolling north in the blazing summer heat and a silence that was different from any silence she had known. She thought about a room with a latch on the inside. She thought about lavender starts in the back of a wagon and a man who said good and meant it. She held out her hand. He put the ring on her finger. It fit. She looked up at him. Yes, she said, in case there was any question. There wasn't, he said, but his voice was different, fuller somehow. Less careful, she laughed. He pulled her in. And Eleanor Whitaker, who had spent 3 years learning to make herself invisible, stood on the porch of the Beaumont Ranch in the Montana afternoon, with lavender growing along the front of the house and marigolds along the fence. And she let herself be held by a man who had been looking for her without knowing it, and she was not invisible, and she was not small, and she was not afraid. She was exactly where she had chosen to be, and that made all the difference. The ring sat on Eleanor's finger through the night, and she kept waking to feel the small, solid weight of it, and remembering what it meant. And every time she remembered, she had to press her lips together against something that was not quite a smile and not quite tears, but lived in the territory between the two. She had said yes, she had meant it completely, and in the morning when she walked out to the kitchen and Silas was already there with the coffee on, and his coat still carrying the cold from the barn, he looked at her hand and then at her face, and the barely contained thing behind his composure was less contained than usual. And she thought, this is what it looks like when a careful man allows himself to be happy. This exact specific unperformed thing, morning, she said. Morning, he said. He poured her coffee. She sat down. They had breakfast. It was the most ordinary morning of her life, and the most extraordinary one, both at the same time, in the way that only the most important mornings are. She told Margaret Hale 2 days later, when Margaret came out to return a pie dish she had borrowed before the hearing and stayed for 2 hours the way Margaret always stayed when she had something to say. Margaret looked at the ring and then at Eleanor's face and made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a laugh, and pulled Eleanor into an embrace that was firm and unambiguous. That man, Margaret said, pulling back and holding Eleanor by the shoulders. I want you to know I had my doubts at the beginning. When people were talking, I thought, well, it doesn't matter what I thought. Tell me, Eleanor said. I thought it was too fast, Margaret said honestly. And too convenient, a woman in trouble, a man with land. I thought, what does he get out of this? She shook her head. And then I watched him in that courtroom, not at the lawyers, not at the judge. I watched him watching you on that stand, and I understood. Eleanor looked at her. What did you understand? That he wasn't watching to see how you'd do, Margaret said. He already knew how you'd do. He was watching because he couldn't look anywhere else. She squeezed Eleanor's shoulders. That's a different thing entirely. Eleanor held that for a long moment. Yes, she said, it is. The news moved through Willow Creek the way all news moved through small towns anyone intended, with details added and subtracted along the way, arriving at each person already shaped by the person before them. By the time Reverend Aldous heard it, he said he was not surprised in the least. By the time Tom Wicker at the livery heard it, he said it was about time. By the time the three old men on the porch of Mitchell's General Store heard it, they had already adjusted their opinion of the entire affair to one in which the outcome had always been obvious to anyone paying attention. Nobody mentioned that they had been paying attention in the wrong direction for 3 years. People were complicated. Eleanor had made her peace with that. What she had not made peace with what arrived on a Wednesday morning 9 days after the proposal, while Silas was checking the south fence line and she was alone in the house, was Martha Mercer at the front door. She heard the knock. She opened the door, and there was Martha. Not in her public clothes, not in the assembled armored presentation that Eleanor had watched her deploy in stores and courtrooms and church pews. She was in plain clothes, her hair less carefully done than usual, and she looked smaller was the wrong word, because Martha had never been physically imposing. She looked reduced, as if something that had been holding her at full height had been removed. Eleanor stood in the doorway and said nothing. Martha looked at her. The silence lasted long enough that a less stubborn woman might have filled it. Neither of these women was less stubborn. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Martha said finally. Her voice was different without the social coating, thinner, older. "All right," Eleanor said. "I'm not here to ask for anything." "All right," Eleanor said again. "I need to say something," Martha said, "and I need you to let me say it without interrupting." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the doorway, not inviting her in exactly. More deliberate removal of the obstacle of herself, and Martha came inside. She stood in the main room and looked around it with the expression of someone who had expected something different and wasn't sure what. "It's a good house," Martha said. "Yes," Eleanor said. Martha turned to face her. "Calvin doesn't know I'm here." "I assumed." He'd be. Martha stopped. Her jaw tightened in a way that was familiar, but the emotion behind it now was not contempt. It was something harder to name. "He's not well," she said. "Since the hearing. She stopped again. "The debt investigation has been formally opened." "County sent a letter last week." "I know," Eleanor said. Crane had written to her. "He doesn't sleep," Martha said. "He doesn't eat properly. He sits in his study," and she pressed her lips together. "He's undone by it. I've never seen him like this. In 30 years, I've never seen him like this." Eleanor waited. Martha looked at her. "I'm not asking you to do anything about it," she said, as if Eleanor might have misunderstood. "I'm not asking you to drop the investigation or speak to the lawyers, or I know that's not something you'd do, and I'm not asking it." "Then what are you asking?" Eleanor said. "Nothing," Martha said. "I told you." She stood very straight. "I'm here to tell you that I know what we did to you. I know it clearly. I have known it for some time and chosen not to know it, if you understand what I mean." Eleanor understood exactly what she meant. "I'm not going to tell you I'm sorry," Martha said, "because sorry is a word that requires you to believe it, and I have not given you any reason to believe a word I say." Her chin lifted slightly, the old habit of a woman who has always held herself above things. "What I'm going to tell you is that you were right. In that courtroom, and before it, you were right about all of it." Eleanor looked at her, at the narrow, pale face, at the quick eyes which were not quick now but very still. At the woman who had taken 3 years of her life and ground them down methodically, and who was now standing in a house that wasn't hers, admitting, without grace and without warmth and without any apparent expectation of forgiveness, that she had done it. "I know I was right," Eleanor said. "I knew it then too." "You made it hard to hold on to." Martha flinched, just barely. "Yes," she said, "I expect we did. The room was very quiet." "Why are you telling me this?" Eleanor said, "if you're not asking for anything? If you don't expect forgiveness, why come here?" Martha was silent for a moment. Because Calvin won't, she said. Because someone should. And because she stopped. Something moved across her face that Eleanor had never seen there before, something complicated and tired. Because I looked at you in that courtroom, and I saw someone I had spent 3 years trying to make small, standing up as any one I've ever seen in a room. And I thought that must have cost her something. Everything I did must have cost her something, and the least I could do was come here and say so. Eleanor stood with that. She did not feel what she had expected to feel if this moment ever came. She had imagined it sometimes, in the worst nights at the Mercer Ranch, imagined some version of accountability, imagined how it would feel. She had imagined triumph or relief or a flooding release of something long held. What she actually felt was quieter than any of that. A simple, clean recognition. The way you feel when a long mathematical problem finally resolves, not joy exactly, just the particular satisfaction of a thing arriving at its true answer. It did cost something, Eleanor said. It cost me 3 years and a great deal of myself. Some of it I've gotten back. Some of it I'm still getting back. Martha nodded once, stiffly. You should go, Eleanor said. Not harshly, not because I'm angry, I'm not particularly. But I don't think there's more to say, and I don't think either of us is helped by standing here longer than we need to. Martha looked at her for one more moment. Then she turned and walked to the door. She stopped at the threshold. He said, "You're to be married," she said without turning around. Yes, Eleanor said. He's a good man, Martha said. Very quiet, Beaumont. I've known him by reputation for years. A pause. I hope you'll be happy. She walked out. Eleanor stood in the middle of the main room and listened to the sound of a horse leaving the yard, and then the quiet that followed it. And she thought about forgiveness, the real kind, not the kind that requires the other person to have earned it. Not the kind that means what was done was acceptable, but the kind that means you are choosing not to carry it anymore because the weight of it is theirs, not yours. She thought about it for a long time. When Silas came in at midday, he looked at her face and knew immediately that something had happened. Tell me, he said. She told him. He listened without interrupting, which was his way, and when she was done he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Are you all right? Yes, she said, and then I think I might be more all right than I've ever been. He looked at her. I don't forgive them, she said. I want to be clear about that. I don't think what they did was acceptable, or that any of it is resolved by Martha coming here. But I think, she paused, working through it. I think I can set it down. The weight of it. I think I can just put it on the ground and walk away from it. Not for them. For me. Silas nodded slowly. That's a different thing than forgiving. Yes, she said. It is. Does it feel different? She thought about it. It feels lighter, she said. Like something I was holding is just gone, and my hands are free. He looked at her hands. She looked at them too, at the ring on her finger. At the hands that had worked in this garden and cooked in this kitchen and planted lavender along the front of this house and pushed back against a courtroom's worth of pressure and come out the other side still themselves. Good, he said. It was the same word he always said. Simple and specific and exactly enough. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand over and held it. They sat like that for a while, in the kitchen that smelled alcohol and wood smoke, and the mint from near the back door, in the house that had been his and was becoming theirs, while the Montana afternoon moved around them with the unhurried certainty of a place that has been here a long time and intends to be here much longer. The wedding was small. This had been their decision together, made in the practical, direct way they made most decisions, sitting at the kitchen table, looking at what they wanted and what they didn't, and saying so plainly. Neither of them wanted ceremony for ceremony's sake. Neither of them needed an audience, but they wanted witnesses. Reverend Aldous came, Margaret Hale and her husband. Garrett Moore and his wife, who had brought 2 jars of her preserved peaches as a gift and pressed them into Eleanor's hands with the warm, uncomplicated generosity of someone who simply likes giving things to people and doesn't need it to mean more than that. Crane sent a letter from Billings that was typically precise and also, underneath its precision, clearly pleased. Ruth Hensley came, which surprised Eleanor and moved her more than she could easily articulate. This woman, who had shared something of Eleanor's experience without either of them knowing it, who had spoken in a courtroom and made something possible that might not otherwise have been, who stood in a yard on a September morning with her hat in her hands and her good dress on, and beamed as if the whole thing were happening to someone she loved. Maybe it was, Eleanor thought. Maybe that was what happened when people decided to stop looking away. Aldous spoke the words plainly, without embellishment, the way a man speaks when he is trying to do justice to something rather than perform it. Silas stood beside Eleanor with the same composed, careful stillness she had fallen in love with, and when Aldous asked him to speak his vows, he turned to look at Eleanor directly, not at the Reverend, not at the witnesses, at Eleanor, and said them to her face. He had written them himself. She had not known he was going to do that. "I promise to tell you the truth," he said, "even when it's inconvenient. I promise to give you room to be exactly who you are without editing. I promise that your voice in this house is equal to mine in every room and on every subject, and that if I forget, that you have my permission to remind me directly." Something moved in his face, the barely contained thing, less contained than she had ever seen it. "I promise that you will never again sleep somewhere that doesn't feel safe. I promise that every morning you wake up here, you are here because you chose to be, and that choice is yours to make every single day, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know it." Eleanor's throat had closed entirely. She had prepared her own vows, she had written and rewritten them, trying to find the right words, trying to match the economy of him, the absence of decoration, and now she looked at him, and the prepared words felt insufficient, and she set them aside. "You asked me a question once," she said, "in Mitchell's general store the first time I saw you. You asked if I was all right. Sheep, I wasn't. I hadn't been all right in a very long time. But something about the way you asked it, like the answer mattered, like you would do something about it if the answer was no, was the first time in years that I felt like a person someone was actually seeing." She looked at the ring on her finger and then back at his face. "I promise to see you the same way every day, for as long as I have," she paused. "And I promise to make the coffee strong." There was laughter from the small group around them. Silas's jaw did the thing it did. Aldous completed the words. And Eleanor Beaumont, the name still new, still finding its shape in her mind, stood in the yard of the ranch that was hers now, that had always been hers from the moment she chose it. And she felt the particular quality of a life clicking into alignment, not perfectly, not without complications still to come, but truly, in the way that things are true when they have been built from honest materials, by people who meant what they said. The autumn moved in after the wedding the way Montana autumn does, fast, bright, cold at the edges, with a clarity to the light that made everything look slightly more itself than usual. Eleanor planted bulbs along the east side of the house, spring bulbs that would sit in the frozen ground all winter, and come up in April, a thing she found deeply satisfying about gardening, this particular act of faith, burying something in cold ground and trusting the season to do the rest. Silas watched her from the porch one afternoon, with his coffee going cold in his hands. "You're going to run out of ground," he said. "I'm going to need more ground," she agreed, without looking up. "I've got more ground," he said. "I know," she said. "It's one of your best qualities." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but lived in the same vicinity. Life on the ranch had its shape now. Their shape together, the early mornings, the work, the meals, the evenings by the fire when the cold came down from the mountains and the wind picked up outside, and they sat in the warmth of a house that was genuinely warm, not just heated. They talked more than Eleanor had expected. Silas, who had seemed a man of few words, turned out to be a man of specific words, someone who said things when they were worth saying, and had plenty worth saying when the conditions were right. They argued sometimes, in the direct, undefensive way of people who have agreed that truth matters more than comfort, about the best way to fix the north fence, about whether the horse needed a different shoe size, about what to do with the spare field next spring. The arguments never left marks. They were just two people with opinions and the confidence to have them out loud. That was new for Eleanor. She cataloged it carefully, the way she cataloged all the new things, not because she was afraid they would disappear, but because she wanted to know them fully, to possess them completely. The way you hold something precious, not because you fear losing it, but because it deserves to be held with both hands. Crane wrote in October, the dead investigation had concluded. The county had determined that the figures Calvin Mercer had cited under various circumstances were inconsistent to the degree that they constituted attempted fraud. Calvin was fined significantly, not ruinously, Crane noted, because ruinous was not the point and formally reprimanded in county records. His standing with the county court was reduced in ways that would make future legal maneuvering considerably more difficult. Silas read the letter at breakfast and set it on the table. Eleanor read it. She set it down. "That's it, then," she said. "That's it," he said. She nodded. She picked up her coffee. There was a silence that needed no filling. What she felt was not triumph. She had thought about this before, had wondered what she would feel when it was formally, legally over, when the last lever Calvin had been trying to operate had been pried from his hand by the county's own process. She had wondered if she would feel something large. What she felt was simply continuation, the same steady real life she had been living, confirmed and uninterrupted. Not a victory over something, just her life, going forward. With no one's permission required. "Margaret Hale is coming Saturday," Eleanor said. "The Peach Preserves woman? That's her husband's contribution. She's bringing her daughter who plays piano, and she wants to hear if I actually play or if I was bluffing." Silas looked at her. "Were you bluffing? I play a little," Eleanor said. "My mother taught me. I haven't played in years." "There's no piano here." "I know," she said. "Margaret's bringing a traveling keyboard her husband built for their youngest." She paused. "It might be a disaster." "Might be," he agreed. He looked at his coffee. "I'd like to hear you play." She looked at him. "Even if it's a disaster," she said. "Especially then," he said. She laughed. He watched her laugh with the specific, private attention of a man for whom that sound has not become ordinary and may never become ordinary, and he thought she could see him thinking it. Could read his face now the way she read weather, that this was what he had not known how to want for 10 years. Not something enormous, not something that would fix the shape of a life changed by loss. Just this, a woman laughing in his kitchen on a cold October morning. The smell of coffee, a ring on her finger, a plan for Saturday. The word came about Daniel in November. She had not expected it. Had not thought about it, had deliberately not thought about it. Had accepted the official account that Daniel had died on the cattle drive and buried him and moved through the life that followed without questioning the account, because questioning it had seemed like one pain too many. But a man came to the ranch on a gray November morning, a traveling man, a leather trader who moved between the far northern territories and the county towns, and he asked to speak to Eleanor Whitaker, to Eleanor Mercer, he said. Which was the name he knew, and when she came out, he took his hat off and looked at her with the expression of someone who has been carrying something for too long and has finally found the right address. "Ma'am," he said, "my name is John Pryor. I knew your husband." Eleanor went very still. "He didn't die on the cattle drive," Pryor said. He left intentionally. He had debts, bad debts, to men worse than Calvin, and he was afraid, and he stopped. Turned his hat in his hands. He went north, into Canada. I ran into him twice up there over the years. He was working for a trapper concern up past the border. Eleanor said nothing. Silas had come out of the barn and was standing at the edge of the yard watching. "I'm telling you," Pryor said, "because he died, genuinely this time. This past winter, fever up in the territories, and before he died he asked me to find his wife and tell her he was sorry." He paused. "He knew what he'd left you to. He'd heard things. He asked me to tell you he was sorry and that he knew it wasn't enough." The gray November morning was very quiet. Eleanor looked at the leather trader with his hat in his hands and his uncomfortable, earnest face, and she thought about Daniel Mercer, the man she had married at 23, the man she had believed in, the man whose absence had delivered her into 3 years of suffering. She thought about what it meant that he had chosen to leave. that the absence had not been death but decision. She waited to feel rage. It was there she could feel its outline, the shape of it, what it could become if she let it. She thought about what she'd told Silas about Martha. About putting things on the ground and walking away. About choosing what to carry. "Thank you for telling me," she said to Pryor. "I appreciate you making the trip." He looked slightly surprised that this was all she said. He had probably expected more tears or anger or something larger than two quiet sentences. "He said he was sorry," Pryor repeated, as if he wasn't sure she'd absorbed it. "I heard you," Eleanor said. "It doesn't change what happened. But I'm glad you told me." She paused. "Is there anything you need before you go? Water for your horse?" He watered his horse. He left. Silas came and stood beside her in the yard, and she looked at the road where Pryor had gone, and she thought about a man who had been afraid and run away, and left her to face the thing he was running from. And she thought about herself at 25, standing at a grave in a dress that didn't fit. And she thought about the letter of credit and the wagon and the room with the latch and the lavender and the ring and the vows spoken in a yard on a September morning. "You all right?" Silas said. She turned and looked at him. "Yes," she said, "I genuinely am. Angry some," she said honestly. "But not," she paused, "not in a way that's going to stay. It doesn't have anywhere to put roots." She looked at the yard, at the house, at the lavender small but surviving along the front of it. "There's no room for it here." He looked at her. "No," he said. "There isn't." She took his hand. They stood in the November yard, and the cold came off the mountains, and the smoke rose from the chimney, and somewhere in the barn the horses moved with their patient, unhurried wait, and it was a plain, unspectacular moment of a plain, unspectacular life, and it was the most complete thing Eleanor had ever stood inside of. Spring came. The bulbs she had planted in the cold ground came up in April, exactly as she had trusted. They would first, the green spears of them pushing through, then the color, yellow and white and deep purple, along the east side of the house. The lavender had wintered well and was thickening now, beginning to spread the way. Lavender spreads when it's happy, unhurriedly but with intention. She sat on the front porch on an April morning, with her coffee going warm in her hands, and she looked at what she had made, what they had made together. And she thought about the woman who had walked into a general store in late July, with a packet of sewing pins and a bruised wrist and a practiced habit of making herself invisible. That woman was still in her. She had not disappeared, and Eleanor was glad she hadn't. She needed to remember her, needed to carry her carefully as a kind of testimony. The evidence of what a person can come through and still be standing on the other side, with flowers along the east wall and coffee in their hand, and someone inside making breakfast. The door opened. Silas came out with his coat on and stood behind her and put his hand on her shoulder, one hand just resting there, present and warm in his. "Eggs are on," he said. "Good," she said. He stood there for a moment, looking at the yard with her. "The lavender's coming in," he said. "It is," she said. "By summer it'll be thick enough to cut." "What do you do with cut lavender?" "Dry it," she said. "Put it in things, make the house smell good." She paused. "My mother used to keep bundles of it over the kitchen door. She said it kept the hard days from feeling as heavy." He was quiet for a moment. "Does it work?" he said. Eleanor looked at the lavender, at the small gray-green plants that she had pressed into the ground with her own hands on an afternoon after a courtroom, after a ruling, after a man had put a ring on her finger and meant it. She looked at what they had become. "I think it does," she said. "I think some things just help carry the weight." His hand tightened slightly on her shoulder. She covered it with hers. They stayed like that for a while, two people on a porch in the spring morning, with eggs on the stove and bulbs coming up along the east wall, and lavender thickening along the front of a house that had been one man's for 10 years, and was now something they had both decided to call home until the eggs needed attention, and the morning needed tending, and they went inside together, into the warm and the ordinary and the entirely chosen life that waited for them there. In Willow Creek, they would still tell the story years later in the way small towns carry the stories that define them, adding and subtracting, shaping it around the parts that mattered most. They would tell it around supper tables and on store porches to daughters and granddaughters who needed to hear it, to women who had forgotten what it looked like when someone refused to look away. They would say, there was a woman everyone ignored, and a man who refused to. They would say, he rode into town one Tuesday morning and saw her when no one else would. They would say, he held out his hand and she took it, and the whole world shifted. But Eleanor knew the truer version. He had held out his hand. And she had taken it not because she was rescued. Not because she was helpless. Not because the world had run out of other options. She had taken it because she had looked at a man who told her the truth and offered her a choice, and she had decided fully clearly, with both eyes open, that she was worth choosing. That was the story, that had always been the story, and it was hers.